The iron bells rang through the storm before dawn, announcing 40 pardons. 40 chains shattered. 40 prisoners walked free into the frozen empire morning. But one cell stayed locked. Inside it sat a woman who had refused to become a lord's possession, and that refusal had cost her everything. She didn't know the emperor himself was already walking through the dungeon toward her door, drawn by something he couldn't name and didn't trust. What she did know was this: men who can't control your mind will try to bury your existence. If you're watching this from your city right now, stay until the end. Drop your location in the comments and smash that like button, because this story is about to get brutal. The dungeon beneath Valorith Fortress smelled like iron and decay. Celine Veilor had stopped counting days after the first month. Time meant nothing when you were buried alive under stone and silence. She sat against the wet wall, wrists raw from the irons they'd finally removed 2 days ago, though the guards never explained why. Her silver-gray dress looked like something dragged through ash. Her hair hung in dark tangles around a face that had once turned heads at provincial trade conferences. That version of herself felt like a ghost now. She closed her eyes and let the dripping water measure the hours. Somewhere above her, the empire continued. Merchants bargained, soldiers drilled, nobles schemed over wine and silk, and down here, women disappeared for the crime of saying no to powerful men. Lord Malric Dine had wanted her brilliance, her trade route strategies, her ability to see economic patterns 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the southern provinces. He'd wanted all of that wrapped in ownership, in possession, and the kind of control that required her to smile while he dismantled her autonomy piece by piece. She'd told him to go to hell. He'd told the imperial courts she was a traitor. 6 months later, she was still breathing in the dark, and that alone felt like victory. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, heavy boots on stone, multiple sets moving with military precision. Celine didn't move. Guard rotations happened twice a day. They'd open the slot, shove in stale bread and water, then disappear. She'd learned not to hope for anything else. But these footsteps slowed outside her cell. Keys rattled, metal scraped. The door swung open and torchlight exploded into the darkness so bright it hurt. Celine raised one hand to shield her eyes. A voice cut through the space like a blade through silk. On your knees. Not directed at her. At the guards. Both men dropped instantly, their armor clanging against stone. Celine's vision adjusted slowly, shapes emerging from the light. A massive figure stood in the doorway, backlit by the corridor flames. Black wolf fur draped over shoulders that looked carved from granite. Steel armor caught the torchlight in sharp angles, and the face above it all belonged to winter itself. Scars ran across his left cheek. His jaw looked designed to break bones. His eyes burned molten gold in the firelight, and when they locked onto Celine, the temperature in the cell seemed to drop 10 degrees. She knew that face. Everyone in the Empire knew it. Emperor Kael Draven, the Alpha King, the man who'd crushed 3 rebellions before turning 30, the ruler whose name made provinces surrender without a single sword drawn. He was staring at her like she was a puzzle that had personally offended him. "Stand up," he said. His voice carried no warmth, no mercy, just absolute authority wrapped in gravel and ice. Celine didn't move immediately, not out of defiance, out of shock. Emperors didn't visit dungeons. Emperors didn't even acknowledge dungeons existed. Yet here he stood, radiating the kind of power that made reality bend around him. She pushed herself to her feet. Her legs shook. 6 months of prison rations and stone floors had carved her frame down to sinew and survival. But she stood. Kael's eyes tracked every movement, calculating, assessing, looking for something she couldn't identify. "You're coming with me," he said. Celine's voice came out rougher than she intended. "Tell me why." The guards both flinched. One of them made a small sound like a trapped animal. Nobody questioned the Emperor. Nobody demanded explanations from Kael Draven and walked away intact. But something shifted in his expression. Not anger. Something harder to name. His head tilted a fraction of an inch, gold eyes narrowing. "Because Lord Malric Dain committed crimes that make your imprisonment look like kindness," Kael said. "And you're the witness who's going to help me destroy him." Celine's breath caught. "You already know what he did." "I know what he did to 47 women across 6 provinces. Fabricated charges. Disappeared lives. Political leverage disguised as justice." Kyle stepped into the cell. He was enormous up close, built like violence given human form. You're the one who refused to break. That makes you dangerous to him, which makes you useful to me. Every word landed like a hammer. Celine's mind spun through the implications. Malrek was one of the most powerful lords in the Empire, untouchable, connected to half the ruling houses. If Kyle was moving against him, this wasn't about justice. This was about power. And after I testify, Celine asked, what happens to the useful witness? Kyle's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. That depends on how useful you stay. He turned and walked out of the cell without another word. The guards scrambled after him. One of them paused long enough to unlock the chain still bolted to the wall, though Celine hadn't worn them in days. Move, the guard whispered. When the Emperor gives an order, you don't make him repeat it. Celine stepped into the corridor. Her legs felt like they might collapse. The torchlight seemed impossibly bright after months in shadow. But she followed the black wolf fur and imperial steel up the dungeon stairs, through corridors she'd only seen once before during her arrest. Every prisoner they passed pressed against the bars, silent, watching. Some of the women looked at her with something like hope, others with envy, most with the empty stare of people who'd stopped believing in rescue. The fortress doors opened into pre-dawn cold that hit Celine's lungs like broken glass. She gasped. Fresh air felt alien. The courtyard spread before her in organized chaos. Soldiers everywhere, horses stamping in formation, supply wagons loaded with provisions. And at the center of it all, a black stallion that looked like it could kill a man by stepping on him. Kale mounted in one fluid motion. He looked down at Celine with those burning gold eyes. You'll ride with my personal guard. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't try to run. And don't test my patience. He paused. Do you understand the situation you're in? Celine met his stare. I understand I'm trading one kind of cage for another. Several guards made choking sounds. The nearest one looked like he might pass out from secondhand terror, but Kyle just studied her for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed. Once. A short, sharp sound that held more surprise than humor. Get her a horse, he said. She rides next to me. The guard captain stammered. Your Majesty, protocol. I don't remember asking for protocol, Captain. I remember giving you an order. The captain bowed so fast he nearly fell over. Yes, Your Majesty, immediately. They brought Celine a gray mare, smaller than the Emperor's warhorse, but still built for speed and distance. Someone handed her a riding cloak. Dark wool, lined with fur, probably worth more than everything she'd owned in her previous life. She pulled herself into the saddle. Her muscles screamed. Her hands shook. But she stayed mounted. Kyle watched her the entire time. Not with suspicion. With something closer to recognition, like he was seeing a reflection of something he'd thought only existed in himself. We ride to Nocturiz, he said, the capital. 3 days if the weather holds. 2 if it doesn't, and we push through the night. His eyes never left hers. Can you make that ride? Celine thought about the dungeon, the months in darkness, the certainty that she would die there and nobody would remember her name. I can make it, she said. Kale nodded once. Then he turned his horse toward the fortress gates, and the entire column moved with him like a single organism. 40 soldiers, 10 supply wagons, and 1 prisoner turned witness riding beside the most dangerous man in the Empire. They rode through the gates as dawn broke over the mountains, and Celine realized something with perfect clarity. She'd survived the dungeon by becoming harder than the stone around her, but survival around Kale Draven would require something else entirely. Because men like him didn't just test your strength, they tested whether you'd bend or break when power itself tried to reshape you, and she had no intention of doing either. The first village appeared 2 hours into the ride, a collection of stone cottages arranged around a central square, smoke rising from chimneys into the gray morning sky. Celine expected the standard imperial reception: fear, submission, people hiding behind doors until the Emperor's column passed. Instead, children ran toward them. A boy no older than 7 sprinted straight at Kyle's horse, waving a wooden sword. Your Majesty! Your Majesty! Did you kill more traitors? Kale reined in his stallion. The entire column stopped behind him with military precision. He looked down at the boy with an expression that somehow managed to soften without losing any of its edge. Not today, Marcus, but I'm working on it. The boy beamed. My da says you're the reason we don't starve anymore. Your da exaggerates, but tell him I appreciate the vote of confidence. A woman emerged from one of the cottages, wiping flour from her hands. Marcus, get away from the Emperor's horse before you get trampled. It's fine, Mira, Kael said. The boy has excellent survival instincts. He stayed clear of the hooves. The woman curtsied, but it didn't look like fear. It looked like genuine respect. Will you be passing through on the return, Your Majesty? Likely not. I'll be in the capital for some time. Then take this. She pressed a wrapped bundle into the hands of the nearest soldier. Fresh bread. Still warm. For the road. Kyle inclined his head. Your generosity is noted. They rode on. Celine watched the villagers wave as the column departed. No trembling, no forced smiles. Actual warmth. She'd spent months believing the Empire ran on fear, that Kyle Draven ruled through terror and brutality. But these people looked at him like he was something closer to a guardian than a tyrant. You're confused, Kyle said without looking at her. Celine, startled. I didn't say anything. You didn't have to. Your face is extremely expressive for someone who survived 6 months in a dungeon. He glanced at her. You expected them to be afraid. Aren't they supposed to be? You're the Alpha King, the man who erased 3 rebellions. The rebellions that would have starved those villagers and sold their children into labor contracts. Kale's voice remained level, factual. Terror is efficient for about 6 months. After that, you need something more sustainable. Fear creates compliance. Protection creates loyalty. I learned that lesson earlier than most rulers. Celine processed that. Your father didn't believe in protection. Kale's expression went blank. My father believed in discipline and consequences, and making sure everyone around him understood that weakness was contagious. He paused. He was also wrong about most things that mattered, but he kept the Empire intact long enough for me to fix it. The honesty caught Celine off guard. Emperors didn't admit their fathers were wrong. Emperors didn't admit anything that could be used against them. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Kale was quiet for several heartbeats. Because you're going to spend the next few weeks inside my court, around my advisors, watching how the Empire actually functions. And if you walk into that environment thinking I'm just another tyrant who happens to feed his peasants, you'll misunderstand everything and get yourself killed within a week. Is that a threat? It's a warning. The palace makes your dungeon look like a vacation. At least in prison, your enemies were honest about wanting you dead. They rode in silence after that. The landscape shifted from villages to forest. Massive pines rose on either side of the road, their branches heavy with snow. The temperature dropped as they climbed into the mountains. Celine's riding cloak helped, but cold still seeped through the wool. Around midday, they stopped at a way station, a fortified structure built into the mountainside, designed for imperial travelers. Soldiers changed horses. Supply wagons were reorganized. Celine was given hot soup that tasted like the best thing she'd consumed in half a year. Kyle spoke with his officers in a corner of the station. Quiet, intense conversations that involved maps and supply lists and tactical considerations Celine couldn't hear, but she watched the way his men responded to him. Not with fear, with focus, like they were part of something larger than themselves. One of the soldiers approached her, young, maybe 20. He had kind eyes and nervous hands. You're the witness, yeah? He asked. The one testifying against Lord Dane? Celine nodded. That's the plan. Good. His jaw tightened. My sister was one of the women he disappeared 3 years ago, accused her of theft when she refused to marry his cousin. We never saw her again. Celine's chest constricted. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Just make sure he burns for it. The soldier walked away before she could respond. Celine stared into her soup, appetite gone. 47 women. That's what Kyle had said. 47 lives erased because they dared to say no. And she was supposed to be the one who brought Malrek down. The weight of it settled over her shoulders like iron. They rode through the afternoon. The mountains grew steeper. The road narrowed to a path carved into cliff faces, with drops on one side that disappeared into white mist. Celine focused on her horse's neck and tried not to think about falling. By evening, they'd reached a second way station, larger than the first, almost a small fortress in itself. Kael's guards secured the perimeter while servants prepared rooms and food. Celine was given a private chamber, small but clean, a real bed, a wash basin with actual hot water. She stared at it like she'd forgotten such things existed. She washed 6 months of dungeon filth from her skin and hair. The water turned gray, then brown, then something close to black. She scrubbed until her skin hurt, until she could smell something other than mildew and stone. When she finally looked in the mirror, a stranger stared back. Sharper. Harder. Eyes that had learned to expect betrayal. Someone knocked. Celine wrapped herself in a robe and opened the door. Kael stood in the corridor. He'd removed his armor. Underneath, he wore dark traveling clothes that somehow made him look more dangerous, not less. His scars caught the lantern light. "Walk with me," he said. It wasn't a request. Celine followed him through the way station to an observation deck built into the mountain face. The view stretched for miles. Snow-covered peaks, frozen forests, and far in the distance, lights that marked another village. "Tell me about the trade routes," Kael said. Celine blinked. "What?" "Your specialty. Before Malrek buried you, you were analyzing commercial flow through the southern provinces. Tell me what you found." This felt like a test. Celine's mind shifted into patterns she hadn't used in months. The coastal routes were being deliberately bottlenecked. Someone was controlling supply flow to drive up prices in the interior provinces. It looked like normal market fluctuation, but the timing was too precise, too coordinated. Who? Malrek and his network. They owned the shipping contracts and the warehouses. They could create artificial scarcity whenever they wanted leverage. Kael nodded slowly. "That's what I suspected, but I needed confirmation from someone who understood the economics." He looked at her. "Your analysis was correct, and it's part of why he wanted you silenced. You could have just read my reports." "I did. They were brilliant. But reports don't tell me whether the person who wrote them can think on their feet when everything falls apart." His gold eyes held hers. "Can you?" Celine felt something dangerous shift in her chest. "I survived 6 months in your dungeon. I think I can handle a bad day." The corner of Kael's mouth lifted. "We'll see." He turned to leave, then paused. "The council will try to destroy you. Not because you're lying, because you're telling the truth, and truth is the most dangerous weapon in the Empire. They'll question your credibility, your motives. They'll suggest you're fabricating everything for attention or revenge." His voice went cold. "Can you handle that without breaking?" Celine thought about the dungeon, the silence, the certainty that she would die forgotten. "They already tried to break me," she said quietly. "It didn't work." Kael studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once and walked back inside. Celine stayed on the observation deck, watching the distant lights flicker in the darkness. Tomorrow they'd reach the capital. She'd enter a world of political predators and impossible power. And somehow she was supposed to stand in front of the Empire's ruling council and dismantle one of their own. The fear should have been overwhelming. Instead, she felt something closer to purpose, because surviving wasn't enough anymore. Malrek had tried to erase her. The Empire had buried her alive. And now she had the chance to make them all remember exactly who she was. A woman who refused to disappear. Amrasumotz. They reached Nocturus on the 3rd day, just as sunset painted the capital in shades of fire and gold. The city rose from the landscape like something out of legend. Obsidian towers, silver bridges spanning impossible distances, crystal fires burning in braziers that lined the main avenues. And at the heart of it all, the Black Palace dominated the skyline like a crown of midnight steel. Celine had seen drawings. Every citizen of the Empire knew what the capital looked like from a distance, but nothing prepared her for the reality of it. The scale, the precision, the way every structure seemed designed to remind you that power lived here and power didn't negotiate. The gates opened before Kael's column arrived. Guards in ceremonial armor lined the entrance. Citizens crowded the streets, not in fear, but in anticipation. They cheered as the Emperor rode past. Children threw flowers. Merchants bowed. And through it all, Kael sat his horse like he was carved from the same stone as the city itself. They entered the palace grounds through courtyards that could have held entire villages. Fountains, gardens, training yards where soldiers drilled in formations that looked like deadly choreography. Celine's mare followed Kael's stallion through gates that closed behind them with the finality of a tomb sealing shut. Servants appeared from everywhere, taking horses, unloading supplies, moving with the efficiency of people who understood that inefficiency in the Emperor's presence meant reassignment or worse. Kael dismounted and handed his reins to a stable master. He turned to Celine. "You'll be given quarters in the East Wing, food, clothing, everything you need to look presentable for the council." His tone was purely business now. "The trial begins in 3 days. Until then, you stay inside the palace. Don't wander. Don't talk to anyone I haven't personally vetted. And don't trust anyone who smiles at you." "Not even you?" The words came out before Celine could stop them. Kael's expression didn't change. "Especially not me." He walked away, officers falling in step around him. Celine stood in the courtyard, suddenly very aware that she was alone in the most dangerous place in the Empire. A woman approached, older, elegant, dressed in dark blue silk that marked her as someone with authority. "Lady Valor, I'm Magistrate Soren. I'll be managing your accommodations in preparation for the trial." Celine barely heard her. She was staring up at the palace towers, at the sheer weight of power concentrated in this single location. "This way," Magistrate Soren said gently. They walked through corridors that seemed designed to make you feel insignificant. Vaulted ceilings, tapestries depicting ancient victories, guards stationed at intervals that made surveillance look like decoration. Celine's footsteps echoed on marble floors that probably cost more than her entire hometown. The East Wing was quieter, still luxurious but with less traffic. Soren stopped at a door carved with silver wolves. "Your chambers," she said, pushing the door open. Celine stepped inside and froze. The room was larger than her family's entire home had been. A 4-poster bed draped in midnight velvet, windows overlooking the frost sea, a sitting area with cushions that looked like they cost a year's salary. And in the corner, a wardrobe already filled with dresses in colors Celine had never worn. "Everything has been prepared per the Emperor's specifications," Soren said. "Meals will be brought at regular intervals. You'll have access to the library and gardens, though I'd recommend staying close to your quarters for now." She paused. "The palace can be overwhelming for newcomers." "That's one word for it," Celine muttered. Soren's expression softened slightly. "You survived the dungeon. You'll survive this. Just remember, everyone here wants something. Figure out what they want before they figure out what you need." She left. Celine stood alone in luxury that felt more dangerous than her cell ever had. Because in the dungeon, at least she knew the rules. Stay quiet. Stay alive. Don't hope for rescue. Here, the rules were invisible. And breaking them probably ended with more than imprisonment. She moved to the window. The city spread below her in organized beauty, lights beginning to flicker on as darkness settled. Somewhere in that maze of power and politics, Lord Malrek Dain was preparing his defense, gathering allies, building narratives that would paint Celine as a liar or a lunatic. And in 3 days, she'd stand in front of the Empire's ruling council and try to destroy him with nothing but the truth that had already cost her 6 months of her life. Celine pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Behind her, the chamber waited with its silk and velvet promises of comfort. But comfort was a trap. Comfort made you soft. And she couldn't afford softness. Not here. Not now. Because the Empire didn't care about justice. It cared about power. And if she wanted Malrek to burn, she needed to be more than a victim telling a sad story. She needed to be a weapon, and weapons didn't flinch. Ok. The next morning, Celine woke to sunlight streaming through crystal-paned windows and the realization that she'd slept in a bed for the first time in half a year. Her body ached from the 3-day ride, but the ache felt different from dungeon pain. This was the kind of soreness that came from movement, from being alive in ways that mattered. Breakfast arrived on silver trays, fresh bread, fruit she didn't recognize, coffee that tasted like something scraped from heaven. Celine ate slowly, aware that her stomach had shrunk during imprisonment. Too much too fast would make her sick. Magistrate Soren appeared mid-morning with a dressmaker and 2 assistants. "You'll need appropriate clothing for court appearances. Stand here." For the next hour, Celine was measured, pinned, and draped in fabrics that cost more than most provincial families earned in a year. The dressmaker worked with brutal efficiency, creating garments designed to make Celine look like she belonged in imperial courts instead of dungeons. "The blue brings out your eyes," one assistant murmured. "Very striking." Celine caught her reflection in a full-length mirror. The woman staring back looked almost regal, dangerous, like someone who could stand in front of power and not disintegrate. She barely recognized herself. "The Emperor wants you in the war chamber at noon," Soren said as the dressmaker packed up. "Don't be late. He doesn't repeat appointments." Celine arrived at the war chamber 5 minutes early. Guards flanked the entrance, both watching her with expressions that gave away nothing. One of them opened the door without a word. The chamber was exactly what its name suggested. A massive table dominated the center, covered in maps marked with tactical notations. Weapon racks lined the walls. Windows overlooked training yards where soldiers drilled in the late morning sun. And at the head of the table stood Kael, studying a map with the focus of someone planning a siege. He didn't look up. "Tell me what you see." Celine approached the table. The map showed the southern provinces, trade routes marked in different colors, cities circled in red or blue based on some classification system she didn't immediately understand. "Supply bottlenecks," she said after a moment. "These red circles are locations where goods get held up. Warehouses. Customs stations. Places where someone with the right connections could control flow. And the blue? Points of distribution, where goods get released back into circulation." Celine traced a route with one finger. "If you control both the red and blue points, you control the entire economic ecosystem of a region." "Who controls them?" "Malrek's network. Or it was, before you started moving against him." Kyle finally looked up. His gold eyes assessed her like she was a tactical asset. "I need you to testify about the economic manipulation. The imprisoned women will make the council uncomfortable, but economics will make them afraid. Because if Malrek could strangle entire provinces without anyone noticing, what's to stop the next lord from doing the same?" Celine understood immediately. "You're not just prosecuting him, you're restructuring power. I'm removing a tumor before it metastasizes. Malrek isn't unique, he's just the most obvious example of a system that rewards corruption and punishes integrity." Kale's voice went cold. "The Empire doesn't survive on fear alone. It survives on function. And when powerful men sabotage function for personal profit, they make themselves obsolete. And you decide who's obsolete. That's what emperors do. We make decisions everyone else is too afraid to make. Then we live with the consequences." He moved around the table toward her. "The council will try to discredit you. They'll suggest you're exaggerating, that you're motivated by revenge, that a woman from the provinces couldn't possibly understand complex economic systems well enough to make these accusations credible." Celine felt anger spike in her chest. "Let them try. They will. And when they do, you can't lose your temper. You can't show weakness. You need to be colder than they are. Sharper. So precise with your facts that they have no room to maneuver." Kale stopped directly in front of her. "Can you do that?" "I spent 6 months in a cell because I refused to let a powerful man own me. I think I can handle a room full of nobles questioning my credentials." Something shifted in Kael's expression, not quite approval, more like recognition. "Good. Because the moment you walk into that council chamber, you stop being a victim. You become a threat to the entire power structure, and threats get eliminated unless they prove they're more dangerous alive than dead." The words should have been terrifying. Instead, they felt like permission. Permission to stop apologizing for surviving. Permission to be exactly as sharp and unforgiving as the Empire had made her. Celine met Kael's stare without flinching. "When do we start preparing my testimony?" "Now." They worked through the afternoon. Kael questioned her about every detail of Malrek's operation, the timing, the specific routes, the names of intermediaries. He pushed her to be more precise, more detailed, to strip away emotion and present facts like weapons. "Don't tell them he's a monster," Kael said at one point. "Tell them exactly how many ships he redirected, how many warehouses he controlled, how much profit he extracted from artificial scarcity. Numbers don't lie. And numbers don't trigger sympathy reflexes that make the council defensive." Hours passed. Celine's voice grew hoarse, but she didn't ask to stop, because this was the first time since her arrest that she felt like she had any control over her own fate. When they finally broke for evening, Kael walked her to the door. "You're stronger than I expected," he said quietly. Celine paused. What did you expect? Someone broken. Someone I'd have to rebuild from scratch. His expression was unreadable. But you're not broken. You're just angry, and anger is useful if you point it in the right direction. Is that what you did? Pointed your anger at the Empire until it bent? Kale's jaw tightened. I pointed my anger at everything that tried to make me weak, including myself. He held her gaze. The trial is in 2 days. Don't waste time being afraid. Fear is a luxury neither of us can afford. He left her standing in the corridor, heart pounding, mind spinning with everything she'd learned. That night, Celine couldn't sleep. She stood at her window, watching the city breathe beneath starlight. Somewhere out there, Malrek was preparing, building defenses, calling in favors. And in 2 days, she'd face him across a council chamber and try to burn his entire world down with nothing but truth and precision. The old Celine would have been terrified, but the old Celine had died in that dungeon. The woman standing at this window was something else entirely. Someone forged by darkness and survival. Someone who'd learned that the only way to beat power was to become something power couldn't ignore. She pressed her palm against the glass, feeling the cold seep through. In 48 hours, the Empire would learn what happened when you tried to bury someone who refused to stay buried. And Lord Malrek Dain would discover that some women don't break. They sharpen. Cliffhanger. The morning of the trial arrived with frost on the windows and tension thick enough to choke on. Celine dressed in midnight blue silk, her hair arranged in a style that made her look like she belonged in imperial courts. Magistrate Soren waited outside her chambers with an expression that made Celine's stomach drop. "What's wrong?" Celine asked. Soren's voice was carefully neutral. Lord Malrek just arrived at the palace. With 12 senators, 20 imperial advocates, and a witness list that includes half the ruling houses in the Empire. Celine's blood went cold. What kind of witnesses? The kind that will swear you're a liar, a criminal, a woman scorned who fabricated everything out of revenge. Soren paused. He's not planning to defend himself. He's planning to destroy you so thoroughly that your testimony becomes worthless. Before Celine could respond, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Heavy, commanding. Kyle appeared around the corner, already dressed in full imperial regalia, black and silver, crown of obsidian, the Alpha King in all his brutal glory. His eyes locked onto Celine's. "They're moving the trial up," he said. "It starts in 1 hour. And Malrek just played his opening move. He's claiming you were his mistress, that you're testifying out of jealousy because he ended your affair." The world tilted. Celine's voice came out raw. "That's a lie." "I know. But it's a lie the council wants to believe. Because if you're just a scorned woman, they don't have to confront the possibility that one of their own is a monster." Kale's expression went deadly. "So here's what's about to happen. You're going to walk into that chamber, and you're going to prove you're more credible than 12 senators and 20 advocates combined. Because if you don't..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. If Celine failed, Malrek walked free. The women he'd destroyed stayed buried. And the Empire learned that power could still do whatever it wanted as long as it smiled while destroying you. Celine's hands trembled, then she forced them still. "Let's go," she said. Kale studied her for one long moment. Then he nodded and turned toward the council chamber. Celine followed him through corridors that felt like walking toward an execution. Guards fell in step around them. Magistrates whispered as they passed. And somewhere ahead, behind massive doors carved with the Empire's crest, an entire room full of predators was waiting to tear her apart. The doors opened, light flooded out, and Celine stepped forward into the fire, knowing that in the next few hours, she would either become the woman who brought down a dynasty, or the cautionary tale about what happens when powerless people try to challenge the powerful and lose everything that matters. The council chamber stretched before Celine like a cathedral built to worship power itself. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadow. 12 thrones arranged in a semicircle, each occupied by a lord or senator representing the Empire's ruling houses. Banners hung from the walls displaying family crests that had survived centuries of war and betrayal. And at the center of it all, a witness stand carved from black marble that looked more like an executioner's block than a place for truth. Celine's footsteps echoed across the floor. Every eye in the chamber tracked her movement, calculating, judging, already deciding whether she was worth believing or worth destroying. Kael sat on the emperor's throne, elevated above the council seats. Crown of obsidian, expression carved from winter. He looked at Celine with the same brutal neutrality he'd probably used while watching armies march to their deaths. No reassurance, no encouragement, just the cold acknowledgement that she was about to enter a battlefield where words were deadlier than swords. Lord Malric Dain stood with his advocates near the chamber's eastern wall. He looked nothing like a monster. Elegant gray hair, expensive robes, the kind of smile that belonged on someone's beloved grandfather. But his eyes held the dead calm of a man who'd destroyed lives and slept perfectly well afterward. When those eyes met Celine's, something flickered behind the grandfatherly mask. Recognition. And beneath that, calculation. He was already planning how to dismantle her. The High Chancellor rose from the center throne, an ancient man with a voice like grinding stone. This council convenes to address allegations against Lord Malric Dain of the southern provinces. Charges include abuse of judicial authority, unlawful imprisonment, and economic manipulation spanning 6 provinces and 47 documented cases. 47. The number hung in the air like smoke. The Chancellor's gaze settled on Celine. The primary witness will testify. State your name for the record. Celine's throat felt lined with glass. Celine Valor, trade architect from the southern provinces. And you claim Lord Malric unlawfully imprisoned you. I don't claim it. He did it. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. One of the senators, a woman with silver hair and razor-sharp eyes, leaned forward. That's quite an accusation. Do you have evidence beyond your word? This was it. The first move in a game where losing meant erasure. Celine kept her voice level. I have the fabricated arrest warrant charging me with treason. I have the testimony of guards who witnessed Lord Malric visiting my cell to offer freedom in exchange for becoming his strategic consultant and his property. I have documentation of the trade route analysis that made me valuable to him, and I have 6 months of scars from the chains he put me in when I refused. She pulled back her sleeves. The marks were still visible, raw tissue that hadn't fully healed, evidence carved into her own flesh. The chamber went silent. Then Malric laughed, soft, almost sad, like a man watching a confused child make a scene. Your Majesty, honored counsel. His voice carried the warm authority of someone used to being believed. This is precisely what I warned you about. Miss Valor suffers from a documented history of emotional instability. Our relationship was complicated, personal, and when I ended our involvement, she reacted with accusations designed to destroy my reputation. Celine's blood went cold. That's a lie. Is it? Malric turned to face her directly. Then explained the letters. One of his advocates stepped forward holding a leather portfolio. He opened it to reveal pages of correspondence. Handwritten, intimate. Celine's stomach dropped before she even saw the content. Letters written in Miss Valor's hand, the advocate said smoothly, expressing affection, discussing personal matters, suggesting a relationship far more complex than she's portrayed. Celine stared at the papers. She recognized the handwriting. It was hers, but the content was wrong, twisted. Sentences taken from business correspondence and rearranged to suggest intimacy that had never existed. They'd fabricated evidence using her actual writing. The council members leaned in, scanning the letters. Several exchanged glances. The narrative was shifting in real time. From powerful lord destroying innocent woman to scorned mistress seeking revenge. Kael's voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. Lord Malric, when did this alleged relationship begin? Malric didn't hesitate. Approximately 18 months ago, Miss Valor approached me with trade route proposals. Our professional relationship evolved into something more personal. When I ended things 6 months ago, she became increasingly unstable. The arrest was necessary for her own protection. Protection, Celine's voice came out raw. You're calling 6 months in a dungeon protection. You were placed in custody after making threats against my family. The Emperor himself can verify the documentation. Every word was a masterclass in manipulation, taking truth and bending it until lies looked reasonable. Celine felt the room tilting. This was how power worked, not through obvious evil, through plausible deniability and manufactured context. One of the younger senators spoke up. The letters do appear authentic, and emotional instability would explain the escalation of accusations. Another voice joined in. We can't ignore the possibility of a personal vendetta disguised as justice. Celine watched her credibility dissolve in real time. The council wanted to believe Malrec, because believing him meant they didn't have to confront the possibility that the system they benefited from was built on casual cruelty. Understanding power means recognizing that people will choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths every single time, especially when the truth threatens their position. Kael leaned forward. Miss Valor, address the letters. His tone gave away nothing, no hint whether he believed her or was simply following protocol. Celine met his gold stare and saw only the brutal neutrality of a man watching a test unfold. She was on her own. Celine turned back to the council. Those letters are real. The handwriting is mine, but the content has been altered. Sentences taken from business correspondence and rearranged to suggest intimacy. It's forgery through reconstruction. That's a serious accusation, the High Chancellor said. Do you have proof? I have the original correspondence. The actual letters I sent discussing trade routes, shipping contracts, economic analysis, none of which contained personal content. Malrec's smile widened slightly. Of course you claim that, but we only have your word against documented evidence. The trap was perfect. Deny the letters and look defensive. Accept them and confirm his narrative. Either way, her testimony was compromised. But Celine hadn't survived 6 months in a dungeon by playing by their rules. You want proof? She turned to face Malrec directly. Ask me about the trade routes, the specific analysis that made you want me working for you. The routes I detailed in those original letters. Malrec's expression didn't change. I don't see how that's relevant. Because if we were having an affair, you'd know the details. The coastal bottlenecks, the warehouse networks, the specific shipping contracts I identified as manipulation points. Celine's voice went hard. So ask me, right now. Prove you actually read my analysis instead of just harvesting my handwriting for forgery materials. The chamber went dead silent. It was a gamble, a brutal, dangerous gamble, but it was also the only move that exposed the lie. The High Chancellor looked at Malrec. Lord Malrec, can you summarize Miss Valor's trade route findings? For the first time, something flickered behind Malrec's calm. Just a flash. But Celine saw it. He didn't know. He'd never read the actual reports. He'd only cared about controlling her, not understanding her work. The details were extensive, Malrec said smoothly. My trade advisors handled the technical analysis. Name one route, Celine pressed. One specific bottleneck I identified. If you valued my work enough to imprison me when I refused to give it exclusively to you, surely you remember at least one detail. Malrec's jaw tightened. This is absurd. I'm not going to perform party tricks to satisfy a woman's desperate attempt to... The coastal corridor through Meridian Port. Celine's voice rang across the chamber. Controlled by the Dain family shipping consortium. Artificial delays created through selective customs inspections. 3 warehouses used to store goods until prices spiked in the interior provinces. A system generating approximately 40,000 gold marks per quarter in artificial profit. She pulled documents from the portfolio Magistrate Soren had prepared, handed them directly to the High Chancellor. My original analysis. Dated 8 months before Lord Malrec claims our personal relationship began. Complete with trade volume projections, profit estimates, and recommendations for regulatory intervention. She looked at Malrec. You wanted this work buried because it exposed your family's primary income source. When I refused to suppress my findings, you had me arrested. The Chancellor read the documents. His expression shifted. Other council members leaned in, scanning the pages. Numbers didn't lie. And Celine's analysis was devastatingly precise. One of the senators, a hard-faced man with military bearing, spoke up. These projections match our current intelligence on trade manipulation in the southern provinces. The economic patterns are consistent with Lord Malrec's business operations. Another voice. The timeline contradicts his testimony. If Miss Valor completed this analysis 8 months ago, the arrest 6 months ago suggests retaliation, not protection. The narrative was shifting again, slower this time, more carefully, but moving. Malrec's advocate stepped forward. Economic analysis proves nothing about the nature of their relationship. Miss Valor could have developed feelings during the course of professional contact. Her technical competence doesn't invalidate Lord Malrek's testimony about her emotional state. Smart, conceding the analysis to protect the larger lie. But Celine wasn't done. Then explain the other women, she said quietly. The chamber froze. Celine pulled another document. This one was harder to hold. Her hands wanted to shake. She forced them still. 47 documented cases. Women imprisoned on fabricated charges after refusing Lord Malrek's advances or his business demands. I've compiled their names, their arrest dates, the charges filed against them, and the pattern is identical across every case. She began reading. Mira Solon, arrested for theft, released after agreeing to marry Lord Malrek's business associate. Kira Venn, arrested for treason, disappeared entirely after rejecting a strategic marriage alliance. Thalia Crost, arrested for fraud. Charges dropped when her family surrendered contested mining rights. Each name landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading. These women all had something Lord Malrek wanted. Knowledge, property, family connections. And when they refused to surrender those assets, they were removed from society using the judicial system as a weapon. Selena's voice went cold. I'm not unique. I'm just the one who survived long enough to testify. The High Chancellor looked at Malrek. Do you deny these arrests occurred? I deny any improper motivation. Those women were processed through legitimate legal channels for legitimate offenses. 47 women, all connected to your business interests, all arrested within territories where your family controls the courts. The Chancellor's voice carried new weight. That's not coincidence. That's pattern. Malrek's smile finally cracked. You're taking the word of a disturbed woman over a lord who has served this empire for 30 years. I'm looking at documented evidence that suggests systematic abuse of authority. The Chancellor turned to Kael. Your Majesty, this requires deeper investigation. But Kael was staring at Celine, not with neutrality anymore, with something that looked almost like recognition, like he was seeing someone reflect back the same ruthless precision he'd spent his life cultivating. When alphas recognize strength in others, it triggers something primal. Not just respect, a kind of gravitational pull towards someone capable of standing in the same fire without burning. Kael stood. The entire chamber went silent. Lord Malrek, he said, you will submit to a full imperial audit, your business records, your court proceedings, every arrest warrant issued in territories under your judicial authority for the past 5 years. If the patterns Miss Valor describes exist in the documentation, you will answer for them. Malrek's face went white. Your Majesty, this is unprecedented. You're allowing one woman's accusations to— I'm following evidence. Kael's voice dropped to something just above a whisper, somehow more terrifying than shouting. And if that evidence confirms what Miss Valor has documented, you won't just lose your title. You'll face execution for crimes against the Empire. The word hung in the air. Execution. Not imprisonment. Not exile. Death. Because that's what alphas do when someone threatens the stability of what they've built. They don't negotiate. They remove the threat completely. The chamber erupted, senators arguing, advocates objecting. But Kael's word was final. The audit would happen. And if Celine was right, Malrek's entire dynasty would burn. Malrek stared at Celine with undisguised hatred. You have no idea what you've started. Celine held his gaze. I know exactly what I've started. The end of you. Guards moved forward to escort Malrek from the chamber. He jerked away from their hands, but walked toward the exit with his head high, playing the dignified lord being persecuted by hysteria. But everyone in the room had seen the cracks in his armor, and cracks were all Celine needed. The High Chancellor dismissed the council. Lords and senators filed out in clusters, already whispering about what this meant for the power structure. Who was vulnerable? Who needed to cover their tracks before the audit expanded beyond Malrek? Celine stood alone at the witness stand, adrenaline draining from her system. Her legs felt liquid. Her hands finally started shaking now that the performance was over. She'd survived. But survival felt less like victory and more like standing on the edge of a cliff waiting to see if the ground would hold. Kael approached. Up close, his presence felt even more overwhelming. Power concentrated into human form. He studied her face with those burning gold eyes. You took a risk, he said quietly, challenging him directly like that. It was the only move I had. Most people would have crumbled, especially when he produced those letters. Most people haven't spent 6 months learning that crumbling gets you killed. Something shifted in Kael's expression. Not softness, but acknowledgement. The audit will take weeks, maybe months. Malrek will use that time to bury evidence, intimidate witnesses, turn the council against the investigation. Can you stop him? I can try. But imperial audits have limits. If his allies decide protecting him serves their interests, they'll obstruct at every turn. Kael paused. Which means you need to stay visible, stay credible, and stay alive long enough for the truth to matter. The way he said it made Celine's skin prickle. You think he'll come after me? I think powerful men don't go down quietly, especially when one woman with a sharp mind just exposed them in front of the entire ruling council. His jaw tightened. You'll stay in the palace, under guard, until this is resolved. It wasn't a request. Celine should have felt relief, protection, safety. Instead, she felt like she'd traded one cage for another. Prettier bars, better food, but still trapped. And after? She asked. After Malrek burns and the audit is complete and justice is served? What happens to the witness who's no longer useful? Kael's eyes held hers. That depends on whether the witness wants to go back to being invisible. What's the alternative? Stay visible, keep working. The Empire needs people who understand economic warfare as well as you do. People who can look at broken systems and fix them instead of just complaining. He stepped closer. People who don't flinch when power tries to break them. The air between them felt charged, dangerous, like standing too close to lightning. Celine's voice came out rougher than intended. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a choice. Disappear back into provincial obscurity, or stay here and help me dismantle every system that made your imprisonment possible. His expression was unreadable. But understand what staying means. You'll have enemies, real ones, the kind who don't stop at dungeons, and you'll be under constant scrutiny from people looking for any excuse to discredit you. Sounds familiar? The corner of Kael's mouth lifted, almost a smile. I thought it might. He turned and walked away, guards falling in step around him. Celine stood alone in the empty chamber, heart pounding, mind racing through implications. She could leave, return to the southern provinces, rebuild a quiet life away from empire politics and the brutal spotlight of power. Or she could stay and become something more than a victim who survived, something sharper, more dangerous. The choice should have been obvious, but nothing about survival was ever simple. Deeds. The palace at night transformed into something both beautiful and menacing. Crystal fires burned in braziers along the corridors. Shadows moved with purpose, and every sound echoed in ways that made Celine hyper-aware of how alone she was despite being surrounded by hundreds of people. She couldn't sleep. The trial had left her wired. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Malrek's face, the careful manipulation, the way he'd almost buried her under lies that sounded more reasonable than truth. Around midnight, Celine gave up on rest and wrapped herself in the heavy robe Magistrate Soren had provided. She left her chambers and walked through the east wing toward the library Kael had mentioned during their ride to the capital. Guards watched her pass but didn't interfere. Apparently, being the Emperor's protected witness came with certain freedoms. The library occupied an entire wing of the palace. Shelves stretched 30 feet high. Ladders on rails provided access to upper levels. Books in languages Celine recognized and dozens she didn't. The smell of old paper and leather bindings filled the air like incense. And at a table near the western windows, surrounded by maps and documents, sat Kael. No crown, no armor, just dark clothes and exhaustion carved into his face. He looked up when Celine entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Can't sleep either? He asked finally. Celine approached the table. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that chamber watching my credibility get dismantled. You rebuilt it. Barely. And only because I had documentation. What about the women who didn't? The ones who disappeared without evidence? Kael gestured to the documents spread before him. I'm trying to find them. The audit is already turning up names, arrest records that don't match crimes, disappearances that align with Malrek's business timeline. His voice went flat. You were right. This wasn't isolated. It was systematic. Celine sank into the chair across from him. How many? So far? 63 confirmed cases, and we're only 5 years deep into the records. The number hit like a physical blow, 63 lives. 63 women who'd said no and paid for it with everything they had. They trusted the system to protect them, Celine said quietly, and the system buried them instead. Because the system was built by people like Malrek, lords who treated judicial authority like a personal weapon, and nobody questioned it because power protecting itself looks like order. Kyle's hands curled into fists on the table. I inherited this empire from my father, and my father cared more about maintaining noble loyalty than fixing corruption. As long as the provinces sent taxes and soldiers, he didn't care how the lords behaved. This was the most Celine had heard him speak about anything personal. She leaned forward carefully. And you care? I care about function. An empire where half the population lives in fear of arbitrary persecution doesn't function long term. Fear creates compliance for maybe a generation. Then it creates rebellion. His gold eyes lifted to hers. My father ruled through terror. It worked until it didn't. The rebellions I crushed? Half of them started because lords like Malrek pushed too hard and the people finally pushed back. So you're not pursuing Malrek for justice. You're pursuing him for stability. I'm pursuing him because he's a virus infecting the system, and viruses spread. Kale stood and moved to the window. But yes, justice and stability aren't separate in this case. They're the same thing. Celine watched him stare out at the sleeping city. Even exhausted, he carried himself like someone ready for battle. Like relaxation was a weakness he couldn't afford. When do you rest? She asked. I don't. Ever? Resting means letting your guard down. And the moment an emperor lets his guard down, someone tries to kill him, or overthrow him, or manipulate him into decisions that benefit them instead of the empire. He glanced back at her. Sleep is a luxury for people who don't have entire kingdoms depending on them not making mistakes. The loneliness in those words was staggering. Celine had felt isolated in her dungeon cell. But Kael's isolation was different, more absolute. He was surrounded by people and completely alone. That sounds like prison, she said softly. Kael's expression shifted. It is, just with better furniture. For a long moment, they stood in shared silence. Two people who understood survival in different contexts, who'd both learned that strength meant swallowing vulnerability and never letting anyone see the cracks. The council will fight the audit, Kael said eventually. They'll claim I'm overreaching, using one woman's accusations to justify imperial interference in noble affairs. Are you? Yes. But I'm also right. And being right doesn't matter if I can't prove it before political pressure forces me to back down. He turned to face her fully. I need your help. I already testified. I need more than testimony. I need you to analyze the financial records, find the patterns I'm missing, build a case so airtight that even Malrek's allies can't defend him without implicating themselves. Celine's heart kicked. You're asking me to weaponize economics against the ruling class. I'm asking you to finish what you started. You exposed one lord. Help me expose the system that protected him. It was everything Celine had wanted. Purpose, agency, the chance to matter instead of just surviving. But it was also terrifying, because working directly with Kael meant stepping deeper into the Empire's machinery, becoming part of power instead of just its victim. If I do this, she said carefully, I become a target, not just to Malrek, to everyone who benefits from the current system. Yes. And you can't protect me from all of them. No, but I can make sure the ones who come after you regret it. Kael's voice went cold. And I can give you the resources to protect yourself. Knowledge, authority, position, the things that make you dangerous enough that attacking you costs more than it's worth. Celine understood what he was offering, not safety, but power. The kind that came with its own risks, but also its own armor. She thought about the dungeon, about Malrek's smile, about the 47 women whose names she'd read in that chamber, the 63 confirmed cases Kael had already found. When do we start? She asked. Kael's expression shifted into something that might have been relief, or respect, or both. Now. They worked through the night. Kael spread financial records across the table, while Celine mapped trade routes and shipping patterns, looking for anomalies, inconsistencies, the fingerprints of manipulation hidden in numbers that were supposed to be neutral. And as dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of fire beyond the library windows, Celine realized something that should have terrified her but somehow didn't. She was exactly where she needed to be. Not safe, not comfortable, but no longer powerless. And powerlessness had always been the real prison. The audit consumed the next 3 weeks. Celine worked 16-hour days analyzing records, cross-referencing arrest dates with business transactions, building timelines that showed manipulation so systematic it looked like infrastructure. Kyle was right. The council fought back. Senators filed motions. Lords claimed imperial overreach. Malric's advocates argued that economic success wasn't evidence of criminality, but the numbers didn't lie. Celine documented artificial supply shortages coordinated with arrest dates. Warehouses controlled by Malric filling up precisely when women refused his advances. Property transfers happening days after disappearances. A pattern so clear it was essentially confession written in ledgers. She presented her findings to Kyle in the war chamber on a cold morning that smelled like coming snow. "This isn't just economic manipulation," she said, spreading charts across the table. "It's feudalism disguised as commerce. Malric was building a private empire inside the imperial structure, using the legal system to acquire assets and eliminate competition." Kyle studied the documentation with the focus of someone planning an execution. How many nobles are implicated? Directly? 12. Indirectly? Maybe 40. Anyone who benefited from the trade bottlenecks or who looked the other way while Malric operated. 40 lords, that's a third of the ruling council. Yes. Kale's jaw tightened. If I move against all of them, I risk civil war. The noble houses will see it as the emperor dismantling their authority. And if you don't move against them, they'll keep operating the same system under different names. Celine met his eyes. You can't fix corruption by being polite about it. I'm not worried about being polite. I'm worried about the empire fracturing before I can rebuild it. This was the impossible calculus of power. Do too little and nothing changes. Do too much and everything collapses. Celine understood it now in ways she couldn't have before working beside Kyle. Leadership wasn't about making good choices. It was about choosing which bad option did the least damage. What if you don't arrest them all at once? She suggested. Start with Malric. Make him the example. Then offer the others a choice. Cooperate with reforms or face the same investigation. Kyle considered that. Turn them against each other? Make cooperation more profitable than resistance. The ones who comply get to keep their titles and estates. The ones who fight get audited next. A slow smile crossed Kyle's face. Dangerous. Appreciative. You think like a tactician. I think like someone who's watched power destroy people. And I'm tired of watching. The smile faded into something more serious. If we do this, you'll be the face of the reforms. The woman who brought down Malric and restructured imperial trade. That makes you either a hero or a villain depending on who's talking. I stopped caring about hero versus villain the day I was arrested for refusing to be owned. Celine's voice went hard. I care about making sure what happened to me doesn't keep happening to everyone else. Kale stared at her for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He walked around the table and stood directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the scars on his face in detail, close enough to feel the heat radiating from him despite the cold morning. I've spent 10 years looking for someone who understands this, he said quietly. Someone strong enough to stand beside a throne without being crushed by it. Most people either want power for themselves or they're terrified of it. You're the first person I've met who just wants it to function correctly. Celine's breath caught. What are you saying? I'm saying I want you to stay, not as a witness, as a permanent advisor. Help me rebuild the trade systems, restructure the provincial courts, fix the empire from the inside instead of just exposing what's broken. It was more than a job offer. It was an invitation into the center of power, to become part of the machinery instead of its victim or its enemy. You barely know me, Celine said. I know you survived 6 months in a dungeon without breaking. I know you stood in front of the ruling council and dismantled a lord with nothing but facts and courage. I know you spent 3 weeks analyzing financial records when you could have disappeared back into anonymity. His gold eyes held hers. That's more than I know about most of the people I've worked with for years. And you trust me. I trust that you want the same thing I do. An empire that functions, that protects instead of predates, where power serves purpose instead of just feeding itself. He paused. Trust isn't about knowing someone's heart. It's about aligning incentives. And right now, our incentives are perfectly aligned. Celine's mind spun. This was everything she'd wanted and everything she'd feared. Purpose, power, but also exposure, risk, the permanent target on her back that came with proximity to the throne. If I stay, she said slowly, I need guarantees. Name them. Authority to make actual changes, not just recommendations that get ignored when they're inconvenient. And protection for the women Malrek hurt, restoration of property, public exoneration, real justice, not just symbolic. Done. I'm not finished. I also need you to understand something. Celine stepped closer. I didn't survive a dungeon just to become someone's decorative advisor. If I'm doing this, I'm doing it with real power. The kind that makes nobles uncomfortable, the kind that threatens their control. Kael's expression shifted into something that looked almost like admiration. You're negotiating with an emperor. You asked me to stay. I'm telling you my terms. For a heartbeat, the Alpha King simply stared at her. Then he laughed. A real sound, deep and genuine. You're either fearless or insane. I'm practical. You need someone who understands economics and isn't afraid of making enemies. I need authority that doesn't evaporate the moment I inconvenience someone powerful. Celine held his gaze. So either we do this as actual equals, or I walk away and you find someone more willing to be managed. The air between them crackled. This was the moment, where Kael either recognized her as a genuine partner or revealed this had always been about controlling her in more sophisticated ways than Malrek had tried. Kael extended his hand. Equal authority over trade reform and judicial restructuring, direct access to imperial resources, and my personal guarantee that anyone who moves against you moves against the throne. Celine took his hand. His grip was firm, warm, the handshake of someone sealing a genuine alliance. Then we have a deal, she said. Kael held her hand a moment longer than necessary. His eyes searched hers. You're going to be extraordinary at this, and that's going to make a lot of people want you dead. Let them try, he smiled. Now you sound like an alpha. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition that went deeper than professional respect. Two people forged by different fires but tempered into similar steel, both willing to burn the world to protect what mattered, both understanding that power without purpose was just violence and expensive clothing. When Kael finally released her hand and stepped back, the distance felt deliberate, like he was reminding both of them that proximity had limits. But the look in his eyes said something else entirely. And Celine walked out of the war chamber knowing that everything had changed. She wasn't a victim anymore. She wasn't even just a survivor. She was becoming something the Empire had never seen before. A woman with actual power who had no intention of using it gently. Point of no return. The final council session convened 1 month after Celine's initial testimony. The chamber was packed, every ruling house represented, senators, magistrates. And in the center of it all, Lord Malrek Dane in chains. The audit had uncovered everything. 63 confirmed cases of judicial abuse, financial manipulation totaling over 2 million gold marks, a network of complicit officials spanning 6 provinces, evidence so overwhelming that even Malrek's most loyal advocates had abandoned him. The High Chancellor read the charges. Each one landed like a hammer. When he finished, the chamber fell into silence so complete Celine could hear her own heartbeat. Kael stood. Lord Malrek Dane, you have been found guilty of crimes against the Empire. Abuse of judicial authority, unlawful imprisonment, economic manipulation, and conspiracy to defraud imperial trade systems. His voice carried no emotion, just cold finality. The sentence is death, to be carried out at dawn 3 days hence. Your titles are stripped, your estate seized, your family name removed from the imperial registry. Complete erasure, not just execution, the total destruction of everything Malrek had built. Malrek's face went white, then red. You're doing this because of her, he pointed at Celine with shaking hands. One woman's lies and you're destroying a dynasty that served this empire for generations. I'm doing this because you're a parasite who mistook the empire's tolerance for immunity. Kael's eyes went cold. And yes, one woman's courage exposed what decades of institutional cowardice protected. Take him away. Guards dragged Malrek toward the chamber doors. He fought against their grip, screaming about injustice and persecution and imperial tyranny, but nobody moved to help him. Because that's what happens when power finally turns against you. All your allies disappear. All your influence evaporates, and you discover that the empire you thought you controlled never belonged to you at all. The doors closed. Malrek's voice cut off mid-scream. The High Chancellor turned to the remaining council members. The Emperor has also decreed comprehensive reforms to provincial judicial systems, new oversight structures, regular audits, and restrictions on noble authority over criminal proceedings. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, some approving, most wary. Everyone understanding this wasn't just about Malrek anymore. This was Kyle Draven reshaping the Empire's power structure. And Celine had given him the weapon to do it. One of the older senators stood. Your Majesty, these reforms represent unprecedented imperial interference in noble affairs. We request denied. Kale's voice cut through the objection. The reforms are not negotiable. You will comply, or you will face the same scrutiny Lord Malrek received. He paused. Any questions? Silence. Good. This council is dismissed. The chamber emptied quickly, nobles hurrying to their estates to bury evidence or distance themselves from Malrek's network, the old order crumbling in real time. Celine stood alone at the witness stand watching the exodus. She'd done it, brought down Malrek, triggered reforms that would reshape the empire, proven that one person with enough courage and precision could topple dynasties. But victory felt strange, hollow, because standing in this chamber where she'd nearly been destroyed, Celine realized something terrifying. She'd crossed a line. She wasn't just exposing corruption anymore. She was actively wielding power, reshaping systems, making decisions that would affect millions of lives. And there was no going back from that. Kale approached from behind. She felt his presence before she heard him. How does it feel? He asked quietly. Terrifying. Good. People who aren't terrified by power usually shouldn't have it. Celine turned to face him. What happens now? Now we rebuild, starting with trade reforms, then judicial restructuring, then everything else that's broken. His eyes held hers. And you helped me do it, as my chief trade advisor, with full imperial authority. The council will hate that. The council hates everything that threatens their control, but they'll comply, because they saw what happened to Malrek, and none of them want to be next. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the only way forward was to jump. Celine took a breath. Then let's burn it all down and build something better. Kael smiled, dangerous, genuine. Now you're thinking like an emperor. They walked out of the council chamber together, side by side. Two people who'd found in each other something rare. Genuine partnership built on mutual respect and aligned purpose. And as they disappeared into the palace corridors, the empire held its breath, because it had just witnessed the rise of something unprecedented. Not a victim who survived, not a ruler who stood alone, but a partnership forged in fire. Two equals who understood that real power wasn't about domination. It was about choosing who stood beside you when the world tried to break you both, and refusing to bend. The first 3 months of reform moved like controlled fire through the empire. Celine worked from a new office in the palace's administrative wing, walls lined with maps and trade projections and documents that would have gotten her killed 6 months earlier. Now she wielded them with imperial authority stamped in Kael's seal. Provincial courts received new oversight structures. Trade routes were restructured to eliminate bottlenecks. Warehouses were audited. Officials who'd grown fat on corruption found themselves reassigned or arrested. The changes rippled through the empire's foundation like cracks spreading through old stone, and every noble who'd benefited from the old system watched with barely concealed hatred. Celine felt their eyes during council meetings, heard the whispers in palace corridors, saw the way conversations died when she entered rooms. They called her the Emperor's weapon, the Southern upstart, the woman who'd destroyed a dynasty and wasn't finished burning. They weren't wrong. But what they didn't understand was that Celine had stopped caring about being liked the day she realized survival required becoming sharper than the blades aimed at your back. She stood in her office reviewing shipping manifests when Magistrate Soren entered without knocking. The older woman's face carried tension that made Celine's instincts spike. "We have a problem," Soren said quietly. Celine set down the documents. "What kind?" 3 provincial governors just filed formal complaints with the High Chancellor. They're claiming your trade reforms are strangling their regional economies, calling for your removal as chief trade advisor. Let me guess. The 3 governors who were Malrek's closest business partners. Yes, but they've gathered support. 15 senators signed the complaint, including some who voted to convict Malrek. Celine's chest tightened. They're turning my own success against me. They're claiming you're overreaching, that the reforms are causing more damage than the corruption they replaced. Soren's expression was carefully neutral. The complaints aren't entirely fabricated. Some provinces are struggling with the new trade structures. Adjustment periods always hurt before they help. So they're using short-term pain to discredit long-term solutions. Exactly. And they're framing it as concern for the Empire rather than resistance to oversight. Soren paused. The Chancellor is calling an emergency session tomorrow. You'll need to defend the reforms. And yourself. After Soren left, Celine stood at her window watching night settle over Nocteres. The city glowed beneath crystal fires and lantern light, unaware that tomorrow the Council would try to dismantle everything she'd built. Power is never given freely. It has to be taken. Then defended again. Because the moment you stop fighting to keep it, someone else takes it from you and pretends they earned it fairly. She worked through the night preparing her defense. Statistics on trade volume improvements, projections showing long-term economic growth, testimony from merchants who'd benefited from reduced corruption, a case built on numbers that didn't care about noble feelings. But as dawn approached, Celine felt something nagging at her instincts. The complaint felt too coordinated, too precise, like someone had been planning this for weeks while she'd been focused on implementation. She was missing something, some piece of the puzzle that would make this all make sense. The answer hit her like ice water. They weren't trying to remove her from power. They were setting up something bigger, using her as bait to draw out Kael's response, to see how far the Emperor would go to protect his advisor, to test whether the Alpha King's attachment to one woman made him vulnerable. Celine's hands went cold. She needed to talk to Kael. Immediately. She found him in the war chamber before sunrise, already armored and reviewing reports. He looked up when she entered, gold eyes sharp despite the early hour. "You've heard," he said. "About the complaint?" "Yes, but it's not about the reforms, it's about you." Kael's expression didn't change. "Explain." "They're testing whether you'll sacrifice political stability to protect me. If you defend me too aggressively, they'll claim you're compromised, that I have inappropriate influence over the throne. But if you don't defend me strongly enough, they'll remove me and prove the Emperor can be pressured into abandoning his own policies. So either way, I lose credibility. Either way, they undermine your authority. The reforms are just the excuse." Celine moved closer. This was never about trade routes. It's about proving the Emperor can be manipulated through emotional attachment. Kael was silent for a long moment. His jaw tightened. "They've been planning this since the day I made you chief advisor. Probably longer, since the trial. They watched you defend me in council and saw weakness. Defending someone isn't weakness. To them it is. Because alphas aren't supposed to care. They're supposed to be calculators who sacrifice anything for empire stability. And you broke that rule when you gave me real power instead of just using me as a temporary weapon." The truth hung between them like a blade. Kael had made himself vulnerable by treating Celine as an equal, by caring whether she succeeded or failed. And the council had noticed, because predators always notice when the dominant wolf develops protective instincts. It means the pack hierarchy might be shifting, and shifts create opportunities for challengers. Kael turned away from her, staring at the maps covering the table. "If I back down, everything we've built collapses. The reforms die. The message becomes clear. Push hard enough, and the Emperor bends. And if you fight too hard to protect me, they'll claim you're ruled by emotion instead of logic. So what would you do?" The question caught Celine off guard. Kael was asking her how to handle his own political crisis, treating her as a genuine strategic partner instead of just the subject being defended. Celine thought carefully. "Let them remove me." Kael's head snapped around. "What?" "Let the council think they won. Remove me from the chief advisor position. Publicly acknowledge their concerns about overreach. She met his eyes. But keep the reforms. Make them about imperial policy instead of my personal agenda. That way they get their symbolic victory, but the actual changes stay intact. That's surrender. That's strategy. You're not protecting me. You're protecting the work, and you're showing the council that you care more about function than ego. Celine's voice went hard. They want to prove you're weak because you value me. Show them you value the Empire more. The silence stretched. Kale stared at her like he was seeing something he hadn't expected, or maybe something he'd hoped wouldn't be there. You're asking me to sacrifice you to win the larger game, he said quietly. I'm asking you to be the emperor instead of the man. Celine felt something crack inside her chest. Because the man might want to burn the council for threatening me, but the emperor knows that symbolic sacrifices prevent actual wars. Kale's expression went blank. The mask he wore when making decisions that required him to kill pieces of his own humanity. Celine had seen it before, during council sessions when he chose policy over mercy, when he sentenced Malrek knowing it would create enemies. But this time the mask felt different, personal, like she was watching him decide whether to cut off his own arm to save the body. If I do this, Kale said, they'll come for you next. Without imperial protection, you become a target for everyone who wants revenge for Malrek or who resents the reforms. I survived a dungeon. I can survive noble assassination attempts. That's not the same thing, and you know it. Then give me resources, quiet funding, protection that doesn't look like imperial favoritism. Let me rebuild my position from the shadows instead of the spotlight. Kale moved around the table until he stood directly in front of her, close enough that Celine could see the exhaustion carved into his face. The weight of 10 years ruling alone pressing into his spine. I don't want to sacrifice you, he said, voice rough. I know, but you're going to. Because that's what alphas do. They choose the Empire over everything else, even when it destroys them. His hand lifted like he might touch her face, then dropped. You understand this better than anyone I've ever met. Why power costs what it costs. Why strength means swallowing everything soft and pretending it never existed. I learned from watching you. Then you learned wrong. Because I'm not strong. I'm just good at hiding how much this destroys me. The confession hit Celine like a physical blow. For a moment, the Emperor disappeared and she saw only the man underneath. Someone who'd spent his entire life becoming harder than the world around him. Who'd survived by treating compassion like a liability. And who was breaking right now because for the first time in years, someone had made him want something more than survival. Celine's voice came out barely above a whisper. Don't make this harder than it already is. It's already impossible. Then make it clean. Remove me tomorrow, publicly. Make it look like you were pressured by the council into recognizing overreach. Let them think they controlled you. And then? Then we keep fighting, just quieter, smarter. Without giving them another target to rally against. Kael's jaw worked. His hands curled into fists. Then he stepped back, and when he looked at her again, the mask was fully in place. The Emperor instead of the man. The council session is at noon, he said. I'll make the announcement myself. Celine nodded. Thank you. Don't thank me. This is the worst decision I've made since taking the throne. He walked past her toward the door, stopped. Didn't turn around. For what it's worth, he said quietly, you would have been extraordinary at this. If the Empire had let you. Then he was gone, and Celine stood alone in the war chamber, feeling like she'd just watched something irreplaceable shatter. The thing about sacrificing yourself for strategy is that it only works if the pain doesn't show, because the moment people see you bleeding, they know where to cut deeper. The emergency council session felt like walking into an execution chamber dressed as a courtroom. Every seat filled. Nobles who usually skipped sessions suddenly present and attentive, the air thick with anticipation. They'd been waiting for this, salivating over it. The chance to watch the Emperor's pet advisor get stripped of power in front of the entire ruling class. Celine entered through the main doors instead of the side entrance she usually used. Let them see her. Let them watch her walk to the witness stand with her spine straight and her expression neutral, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing fear. The High Chancellor called the session to order, read the complaint filed by the 3 governors. listed the senators who'd signed in support, made it sound reasonable, concerned. A loyal opposition worried about unintended consequences rather than a coordinated attack designed to undermine imperial authority. One of the governors stood to speak, a thin man with sharp features and sharper eyes, Lord Varen. He'd been one of Malrek's closest allies until the trial made association toxic. "Your Majesty," Varen said smoothly, "no one questions Miss Valor's intelligence or her intentions. But good intentions implemented without proper oversight create chaos. The trade reforms have disrupted established commercial relationships. Merchants are struggling. Provincial economies are contracting. We cannot sacrifice prosperity for ideological purity." Several senators nodded. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Celine watched it unfold with cold detachment. They'd practiced this, coordinated talking points, built a narrative that sounded responsible instead of vindictive. Another senator rose. "We recommend a temporary suspension of the reforms pending comprehensive economic impact analysis, and respectfully suggest that Miss Valor's role be reevaluated to ensure appropriate checks on authority." Translation: strip her of power and kill the reforms, but wrapped in language that sounded like governance instead of revenge. The High Chancellor turned to Kael. "Your Majesty, how does the throne respond?" Kael sat motionless on the Emperor's throne, crown of obsidian, expression carved from ice. He looked at Celine once, just once, and in that brief moment she saw everything he was about to do to himself. Then he spoke. "The Council's concerns are noted and valid." Shocked silence. Several senators exchanged glances like they couldn't believe what they'd just heard. Kael continued, voice flat and precise. "The trade reforms were implemented rapidly to address systemic corruption. That speed created disruption. Some of that disruption was necessary, some was excessive." His gold eyes moved across the chamber. "Miss Valor served with distinction, but the Council is correct that concentrated authority without oversight creates risk. Therefore, effective immediately, the position of Chief Trade Advisor is dissolved." The chamber erupted. Some nobles looked triumphant, others confused, a few genuinely concerned. Celine stood perfectly still, showing nothing, feeling everything. "The reforms themselves will continue," Kael said, voice cutting through the noise, "but under direct imperial supervision with council input. Miss Valor will be reassigned to an advisory role without executive authority. The council will form a committee to evaluate economic impact and recommend adjustments." It was a masterclass in political surgery. Give them the symbolic victory while protecting the core policies. Make it look like compromise while actually reinforcing imperial control. But it still felt like amputation. Lord Varen stood again. "Your Majesty, with respect, an advisory role for Miss Valor still represents inappropriate influence given her personal connection to Huamkiti. Careful, Lord Varen." Kael's voice dropped to something just above a whisper. "You're about to suggest that the Emperor's professional judgments are compromised by personal feelings. That's dangerously close to accusing your ruler of incompetence." Varen went white. "I would never—" "Then sit down. The decision is made. Miss Valor retains advisory status. The reforms continue under modified oversight, and this council will focus on governance instead of political theater." The session ended quickly after that. Nobles filed out in clusters, already spinning the narrative. Some saw it as council victory, others as emperor compromise. A few recognized it for what it was, Kael sacrificing a piece to protect the board. Celine left through the side exit before anyone could approach her. Walked through palace corridors that suddenly felt different, colder, more hostile, because authority changes how spaces feel. With power, you move through the world like you own it. Without power, you're just another body waiting to be displaced. She reached her office and stopped in the doorway. Guards were already there, removing documents, sealing files, making the space ready for whoever would occupy it next. One of them looked up apologetically. "Orders from the administrative office, miss. We're to secure all materials related to trade oversight." Celine nodded. "Take what you need." She turned and walked away before they could see her face crack. Hours later, Celine stood in her chambers staring at nothing. The sun was setting. painting the sky in shades of fire that felt cruelly beautiful. She'd lost her position, her authority, her ability to make the changes that had given her purpose. And she'd done it to herself, suggested the strategy, convinced Kyle to sacrifice her, because she'd believed it was the right tactical move. But tactics didn't care about the hollow feeling in your chest when you realized you'd just dismantled the first meaningful thing you'd built since escaping that dungeon. Someone knocked. Celine didn't move. "Come in." Magistrate Soren entered, carrying a sealed envelope. "This arrived for you. Personal courier. Imperial seal." Celine took the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper with Kyle's handwriting. "Library. Midnight. Come alone." That was all. No explanation, no context. Just the command of someone who still expected to be obeyed despite everything that had happened in that council chamber. Celine crumpled the note, then smoothed it out. Read it again. She should ignore it. Distance herself from Kyle before association caused more damage. Rebuild her life away from palace politics and empire games. But midnight found her walking through empty corridors toward the library anyway, because some gravitational pulls are stronger than strategy, and Kyle had become one of them. He was waiting by the western windows. No armor, no crown, just exhaustion and something that looked like barely controlled fury. "You shouldn't have come," he said without turning around. "You summoned me. I gave you an out. You could have ignored it." Celine moved closer. "Since when have I done what's safe?" Kale finally looked at her. His eyes held the kind of intensity that made breathing difficult. "The council thinks they won today. They're celebrating, planning their next move to consolidate power. Let them celebrate. The reforms are still intact." "The reforms are compromised. Oversight committees mean delays, negotiations, everything we were trying to avoid. It's still better than total collapse." "Is it?" Kyle's voice went harsh. "Because from where I'm standing, I just destroyed the most effective advisor I've ever had to appease nobles who care more about protecting corruption than fixing it. You did what emperors do, made the hard choice. I made the coward's choice. I sacrificed you instead of fighting for what was right." Celine felt something sharp twist in her chest. "Don't do this." "Do what?" "Pretend this was about cowardice. You protected the Empire. That's your job. My job is to make the Empire worth protecting, and right now I'm failing." Kale moved toward her. "They wanted to prove I was weak because I value you, so I proved I'm weak by sacrificing you. Either way, they win. They win if you let this break you. They win if you start doubting every decision because one backfired. It didn't backfire. I chose wrong. There's a difference." The confession hung between them. Raw, honest, the kind of vulnerability Kyle had spent his entire life learning to suppress. Celine's voice came out softer than intended. "Then what should you have done?" "Burn them, all of them, every senator who signed that complaint, every governor who filed it, made an example so brutal that no one would ever question imperial authority again. That's tyranny. That's survival. That's what my father would have done, and his empire stood for 40 years. His empire also triggered 3 rebellions and nearly collapsed before you took over." Kyle's jaw tightened. "So I'm damned either way. Rule through fear and watch it crumble. Rule through compromise and watch them tear me apart." Celine understood then what was really happening. Kale wasn't just angry about losing a political battle. He was questioning everything he'd built, every choice he'd made to be different from his father, every moment he'd chosen strategy over violence. And that kind of doubt in someone who commanded absolute power was terrifying. "Listen to me," Celine said firmly. "You are not your father. And today wasn't weakness. It was you choosing long-term stability over short-term dominance. That takes more strength than burning people alive." "Does it?" "Because right now it feels like I just proved everyone right. The Emperor is soft, manipulatable, vulnerable because he cares about one woman more than he should." The words landed like blows. Celine's breath caught. Kale stepped closer. "You want to know the real reason I removed you today? It wasn't strategy. It was fear. Because every day you stay in power, you become more of a target, and every day I care more about keeping you alive than I do about anything else. That's not leadership. That's..." He stopped. Didn't finish the sentence. Didn't have to. The unspoken word hung between them like lightning waiting to strike. Celine's voice came out rough. Don't. Don't what? Don't admit that working beside you for 3 months destroyed every defense I spent 10 years building? Don't acknowledge that I wake up thinking about whether you're safe and go to sleep calculating threats against you? Don't make this about us when it's about the Empire. It's always been about us. Kale's eyes blazed. Since the moment I walked into that dungeon and saw you refusing to bow. Since you challenged me during the trial. Since you stood in my war chamber and taught me things about power I'd never understood, despite ruling for a decade. Celine felt her control cracking. You're exhausted, you're angry, I'm honest for the first time in years. He moved even closer. And you're terrified because you feel it too. The air between them crackled, dangerous, inevitable, every moment of working together, every late night in the library, every time their eyes met across council chambers and spoke whole conversations without words. It had been building toward this since the beginning. Celine's hands trembled. If we do this, everything changes. Everything already changed. I just admitted it out loud. The council already believes we're involved. Today proved that. So we can keep pretending we're purely professional, or we can stop lying to everyone, including ourselves. Celine's heart hammered. This is exactly what they want. Proof that the Emperor is compromised. Then let them have it, because I'm done sacrificing what matters to protect people who don't deserve protection. He kissed her, and the careful distance they'd maintained shattered completely. It wasn't gentle. It was months of restraint collapsing, strategic masks breaking, two people who'd spent their lives controlling everything finally admitting they couldn't control this. Celine's hands fisted in his shirt. Kale's fingers tangled in her hair, like they were trying to anchor themselves to something real in a world built on manipulation and performance. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the library felt different, smaller, like the Empire outside had contracted down to just this moment. This is a mistake, Celine whispered. Probably. They'll use it against us. Definitely. And you don't care, Kale's forehead pressed against hers. I stopped caring about a lot of things the moment I started caring about you. It should have been romantic. Instead, it felt like watching a foundation crack. Because alphas who fall in love become vulnerable, and vulnerability in power invites destruction. Celine pulled back. We can't do this. You just did. I mean, we can't let it continue. You're the Emperor. You need focus, clarity, not... She gestured between them. This, you think I don't know that? Kale's voice went rough. You think I don't understand that every moment I spend caring about you is a moment I'm not calculating threats or planning strategies or being what the Empire needs? Then stop. I tried. For 3 months I tried. It didn't work. Try harder, Kale laughed. It sounded broken. That's rich coming from the woman who told me to be the Emperor instead of the man. Now you're asking me to stop being human entirely. I'm asking you to survive. Because the moment your enemies realize you love me, they'll use me to destroy you. They already know. Suspecting isn't the same as confirmation. Then we just confirmed it. Kale's eyes held hers. And honestly, I don't care anymore. Let them come. Let them try. I'll bury every single person who thinks they can use you against me. The violence in those words should have been terrifying. Instead, Celine felt something dangerous warm in her chest. Because that's what broken people do. They mistake protection for love, possession for partnership, and they convince themselves that burning the world to keep one person safe is somehow different from tyranny. Celine forced herself to step back, put physical distance between them before the gravitational pull became inescapable. I need to leave the palace, she said. Kale went very still. What? You were right earlier. As long as I'm here, I'm a target. And as long as I'm a target, you'll make decisions based on protecting me instead of protecting the Empire. So you're just leaving. I'm removing the vulnerability. You'll be able to rule without worrying about whether caring about me will get us both killed. That's not how this works. That's exactly how it works. Distance creates safety, for both of us. Kale's expression went blank, the mask slamming back into place. This is about today. You're angry I sacrificed your position. This is about tomorrow, and every day after. I can't be the weakness that brings you down. You're not a weakness. Then why did you kiss me like you were drowning? The question hit its mark. Kyle flinched. Celine continued, voice steady despite everything breaking inside. You're exhausted. You're isolated. You've spent 10 years being harder than everyone around you. And I made you soft. That's dangerous. For you, for the Empire, for everything we've been trying to build. So you're making this decision for me. I'm making the decision you can't because you're too close to see it clearly. I see perfectly clear. You're running. I'm surviving. The way you taught me. The words landed like blades. Cale's jaw worked. His hands curled into fists. And for a moment, Celine saw the man who'd crushed 3 rebellions. The Alpha who'd inherited an empire at 20 and forged it into something that bent nations. Then the mask cracked. Just slightly. Just enough. Don't go, he said quietly. 2 words, stripped of command. Just a request from someone who'd spent his entire life not asking for anything. Celine felt her resolve wavering. I have to. Why? Because if I stay, you'll choose me over the Empire. Eventually. When the choice becomes impossible. And that choice will destroy everything you've built. Then let it burn. You don't mean that. Right now I do. And that was the problem. Right now in this moment, Kyle meant it completely. But tomorrow he'd wake up as Emperor, calculate consequences, realize the costs, and hate himself for tonight's honesty. Celine had to leave before they both made promises they couldn't keep. I'll be gone by morning, she said. Kale's expression went dead. If you walk out that door, I won't stop you, but I also won't protect you. You'll be on your own. It was meant to hurt, a threat disguised as consequence, the Alpha asserting control when emotional appeals failed. Celine met his eyes. I've been on my own since the dungeon. I'll survive. She walked toward the door, made it 3 steps before Kyle's voice stopped her. You want to know the real reason I went to that cell? Celine paused, didn't turn around. I'd been hearing about you for weeks, Kyle continued. Reports about a woman who'd rejected Malrek's demands, who'd rather rot in a dungeon than surrender her principles. And I thought anyone that stubborn was either insane or extraordinary. His voice went rough. I went there to decide which. And the moment you looked at me without flinching, I knew. Celine's hands trembled. Knew what? That you were going to ruin me, one way or another. The confession hung in the library silence, heavy, irrevocable. Celine didn't turn around. Couldn't. Because if she looked at him now, she'd stay. And staying meant watching Kyle destroy himself, trying to protect her. Goodbye, Kyle. She walked out before he could respond. Through corridors that felt like labyrinths, past guards who pretended not to notice tears on the face of a woman who'd just lost everything twice. Back in her chambers, Celine packed what little she owned. Clothes Magistrate Soren had provided. Documents she'd managed to keep. The life she'd built in 3 months condensed into a single bag. Dawn arrived cold and gray. Celine left the palace through a servant's entrance, avoiding main corridors where she might encounter people who'd ask questions. The city was just waking, merchants setting up stalls, workers heading to early shifts, life continuing like the Empire's center hadn't just cracked. Celine walked until the Black Palace disappeared behind buildings and morning fog, until she was just another person in the crowd, instead of the woman who'd brought down dynasties. And somewhere behind her, in a library filled with maps and strategic calculations, an emperor sat alone, realizing too late that the thing he'd been protecting was the one thing he'd just destroyed. Celine found shelter in the merchant district 3 miles from the palace, a boarding house run by a widow who asked no questions as long as rent arrived on time. The room was small, a bed, a table, a window overlooking an alley where cats fought over scraps and children played games that involved more screaming than rules. It was nothing like the palace, and that was exactly what Celine needed. She spent the first week doing nothing, sleeping until noon, walking through markets without purpose, letting her mind go blank after months of constant calculation. The exhaustion she'd been suppressing crashed over her like a wave, and she surrendered to it completely. But by the second week, the restlessness started creeping back. Her hands needed work. Her mind needed problems to solve. Sitting idle felt like dying slowly. Celine began visiting the merchant quarters, listening to traders complain about shipping delays and customs corruption. The reforms she'd implemented had helped some, hurt others, created gaps in the system where new problems festered. She started offering quiet advice, anonymous suggestions to merchants struggling with new trade routes. By the third week, people were seeking her out, asking the woman in the boarding house for help navigating the restructured commerce systems. She charged nothing, just fixed problems because fixing things was the only way she knew how to breathe. A month after leaving the palace, Celine sat in a crowded tavern reviewing shipping manifests for a spice merchant when someone slid into the chair across from her. Magistrate Soren, dressed in civilian clothes, face carefully neutral. Celine set down the documents. "You shouldn't be here." "Probably not, but neither should you be living in a boarding house when you have palace quarters." "Had palace quarters." Past tense. Soren's expression softened slightly. "The Emperor has been asking about you." Celine's chest tightened. "Tell him I'm fine." "I think he knows you're fine. That's not what he's asking." Soren paused. "He wants to know if you're safe." "Safe from what?" "I'm nobody now, just another merchant consultant trying to make rent." "You're never going to be nobody, Celine. Not after what you did, and not after the way he looked at you in that library." The words hit harder than intended. Celine's hands curled into fists under the table. "How do you know about the library?" "I don't know specifics, but I know the Emperor, and I've never seen him break the way he did after you left." Soren leaned forward. "He's making mistakes, small ones, hesitations during council sessions, decisions that take too long. The nobles are noticing. Then he'll adapt. That's what he does. Not when the thing breaking him is irreplaceable." Celine stood abruptly. "I can't have this conversation." "Wait." Soren's voice went sharp. "There's something else. Something you need to know before you disappear completely." Celine paused. "What?" "Lord Varen and his coalition are planning something. I don't have details, but there's been too many closed-door meetings, too much coordination between houses that normally compete. They're building towards something big." "Let them build. It's not my problem anymore." "It will be, because whatever they're planning involves you. Your name keeps appearing in fragments of conversations, like you're a piece they're still trying to move." Cold dread settled in Celine's stomach. "I'm out of the game. I have no power, no position. I'm not useful to them anymore." "You're useful as a symbol. The woman who brought down Malrek, who influenced the Emperor, who represents everything they're trying to destroy." Soren's eyes held genuine concern. "Be careful. And if you need help, the palace still has people who remember what you did for the Empire." She left before Celine could respond, disappeared into the evening crowd like she'd never been there. Celine stood in the tavern doorway, watching merchants haggle and dock workers drink away their wages, and felt the familiar weight of danger settling over her shoulders. She'd thought leaving would create safety. Distance from power meant distance from threats. But power didn't work that way. Once you'd touched it, shaped it, redirected it, you carried the mark forever. And people who wanted to strike at power went after the marks it left behind. That night, Celine couldn't sleep. She stood at her window watching the alley below, hyper-aware of every shadow, every sound, the survival instincts she'd honed in the dungeon screaming that something was coming. 3 days later, it arrived. Celine was walking back from the market district when she noticed the pattern. 2 men trailing her, keeping distance, changing positions. Professional surveillance trying to look casual. She took a sharp turn down a side street. They followed. Confirmed. Celine's mind raced through options. Confront them, lose them, find somewhere public and force them to back off. But before she could decide, someone stepped out of a doorway ahead, blocking the narrow street. Lord Varen, smiling like a concerned citizen who'd accidentally encountered an old acquaintance. "Miss Valor, what a pleasant surprise." Celine stopped. Behind her, the 2 surveillance men closed distance, not threatening, just removing escape routes. "Lord Varen, you're a long way from the palace." "As are you. I wanted to check on your well-being. You left so suddenly. No farewell? No forwarding arrangements?" His smile widened. "Almost like you were running from something." "I was leaving. There's a difference." "Is there?" Varen moved closer. Because from where I stand, you look like a woman who realized she'd overplayed her hand, who fled before consequences arrived. Celine kept her voice level. What do you want? Conversation, clarity, understanding. Varen gestured to a nearby building. There's a private room upstairs, quiet, comfortable, perfect for discussing matters of mutual concern. I have nothing to discuss with you. I think you do. Because right now, you're vulnerable. No imperial protection, no official position, no resources beyond what you carry. His eyes went cold. And the Empire has a long memory for people who destabilize power structures. The threat was clear: cooperate or face consequences that wouldn't involve official channels. Celine calculated quickly. She could scream, draw attention, but this was the merchant district. Nobody here cared about one woman's problems enough to interfere with nobility. And fighting would just give Varen's men excuse to drag her somewhere quieter. Sometimes the only way out is through. Fine, Celine said. One conversation. The room upstairs was exactly what Varen promised. Private, quiet, with guards stationed outside to ensure privacy stayed enforced. Varen sat across from Celine at a small table, poured wine she didn't touch, settled into his chair like a man about to deliver a rehearsed speech. You're remarkably talented, he began. What you did with those trade reforms was brilliant, devastating, exactly the kind of precision the Empire needs. Flattery doesn't work on me. I'm not flattering, I'm acknowledging reality. You have skills the Empire desperately needs. Unfortunately, you also have terrible judgment about alliances. Meaning what? Meaning you attached yourself to an emperor who's losing control. Kael Draven is weak, compromised, more concerned with proving he's not his father than actually ruling effectively. Varen leaned forward. The Empire needs strength, real strength, not philosophical debates about governance. Celine understood where this was going. You're planning a coup. We're planning a transition. Kael steps down. A council of lords assumes authority until a stronger emperor emerges. Order is maintained. The Empire survives. And you expect me to support this? I expect you to recognize political reality. Kael is deteriorating, making emotional decisions, losing the respect of the ruling class. If he continues, the Empire will fracture. But if he steps aside peacefully, stability continues. It was almost convincing, wrapped in concern for the Empire, disguised as pragmatic governance, but underneath was the same hunger for power that had driven Malrek. Why tell me this? Celine asked. Because you have influence over him, more than anyone else. If you support the transition, Kael might accept it peacefully, but if you oppose it, Varen's smile turned sharp. Then you become an obstacle, and obstacles are removed. There it was, the real threat. Support the coup or die. Celine's voice came out cold. You're asking me to betray the one person who actually tried to fix this empire. I'm asking you to save it. Kael's reforms are strangling commerce, alienating the nobility, creating instability that invites rebellion. We're offering a better path. You're offering tyranny by committee instead of by individual. That's not better. It's just more cowards sharing the blame. Varen's expression hardened. I'm trying to give you a chance to survive this. Don't waste it on loyalty to a failing emperor. He's not failing. He's just not cruel enough for you to control. He's weak, and weakness in power gets people killed. Varen stood. You have 3 days to decide. Support the transition or face consequences. Choose wisely. He left. Guards remained outside the door, not quite imprisoning her, just making it clear that leaving would happen on their timeline. Celine sat in the empty room, mind racing. A coup. Actual organized overthrow of imperial authority, and they wanted her blessing or her silence, neither of which she intended to provide. But escaping this building and getting word to Kael required getting past professional guards who'd been told to prevent exactly that. The thing about surviving dungeons and political machinations is you learn that impossible situations just require creative solutions and willingness to take damage. Celine stood and walked to the window, 3 stories up, alley below, no obvious handholds, but the building next door was close enough, maybe 5 feet of open air between. She'd never jumped between buildings before, but she'd also never brought down dynasties before 6 months ago. First time for everything. Celine opened the window. The guards outside the door shouted. Footsteps pounded toward the room. She didn't wait, just climbed onto the sill and jumped. 5 feet of empty air. Wind rushing past. The certain knowledge that missing meant broken bones or death. She hit the opposite building's ledge hard, fingers scrambled for purchase. Found it. Pulled herself up as guards appeared in the window behind her, shouting orders. Celine didn't look back, just climbed. Down the building face, using window ledges and architectural details that weren't designed for climbing, her hands scraped raw, muscles screaming, but she made it to the alley and ran, through merchant quarters, past startled vendors, into crowds where pursuit meant causing scenes that drew attention. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt liquid, until the boarding house appeared ahead and she could finally stop. Inside her room, Celine locked the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. 3 days. She had 3 days before Varen's patience expired and consequences began, which meant she had less than 72 hours to warn Kyle about the coup and help him prevent it. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd left to protect him from her vulnerability. Now she was the only one who could protect him from actual destruction. Celine gathered what few possessions mattered, left money for the widow who'd asked no questions, and disappeared into the evening streets toward the one place she'd sworn never to return. The Black Palace rose against the night sky like a monument to power that never slept. Celine approached through servant entrances she'd learned during her months working there. Guards recognized her. Some nodded. Others looked confused. "I need to see the Emperor," Celine told the entrance captain. "Miss Valor, you're not authorized. I have information about a coup. Either let me through or explain to Kale why you blocked a warning about nobles planning to overthrow him." The captain's face went pale. He signaled to another guard. "Escort her to the war chamber, immediately." They moved through corridors Celine had walked 1,000 times, past rooms where she'd planned reforms and fought with senators and learned what it meant to wield power instead of just survive its consequences. Everything looked the same, but she felt different, changed by a month of distance and the certainty that leaving hadn't solved anything. The war chamber doors opened. Kale stood at the map table, reviewing documents. He looked up when Celine entered. For a moment, neither of them moved. The month apart vanished. All the careful distance collapsed. His eyes held hers with an intensity that made breathing difficult. Then his expression shuddered, the mask slamming into place. "You shouldn't be here." "I know, but you need to hear this." Celine explained everything. Varen's approach, the planned transition, the 3-day ultimatum, the coordinated nobility preparing to remove Kyle from power. As she spoke, Kale's expression went from neutral to something carved from winter itself. When she finished, silence stretched between them like a blade. "How many houses are involved?" he asked finally. Varen mentioned a coalition. "I'd estimate at least 20, maybe more. 20 houses. A third of the nobility openly planning treason." Kyle's hands curled into fists on the table. "And they think I'll just step aside peacefully. They think you're weak, that reforms made you soft, that you care more about being different from your father than maintaining control. They're about to learn how wrong they are." The cold fury in his voice made Celine's skin prickle. This was the Alpha King stripped of philosophical restraint. The conqueror who'd crushed rebellions. The emperor who could burn entire provinces to ash and sleep perfectly well afterward. "What are you going to do?" Celine asked. Kale looked up at her, gold eyes blazing. "What I should have done a month ago. Make an example so brutal that no one ever questions my authority again. That's exactly what they're expecting. They'll use it as proof you're a tyrant. Turn the other houses against you. Then they all burn. I'm done compromising with people who mistake patience for weakness." Celine recognized the shift happening in real time. Kale tipping from strategic calculation into something more primal. The part of him that had been suppressed for 10 years roaring back to life. "Listen to me," she said urgently. "If you slaughter 20 noble houses, you trigger civil war. The empire fractures. Everything you built collapses. Everything I built was already collapsing. The council fought every reform. Nobles undermined every policy. I tried being better than my father, and all it did was make them think I was controllable." His voice went harsh. "Maybe he was right. Maybe fear is the only language power understands." "You don't believe that." "I don't know what I believe anymore. I know I'm exhausted. I know compromise doesn't work. I know caring about things makes you vulnerable. His eyes locked onto hers. And I know the moment you walked out of this palace, something broke inside me that I don't know how to fix. The confession hung between them, raw, devastating. Celine's voice came out rough. Then don't fix it. Use it. Let them see that the Emperor isn't weak. He's just been choosing mercy. But mercy has limits. What are you suggesting? Arrest Varen. Publicly. Charge him with conspiracy to commit treason. Let him stand trial in front of the full council. Make them choose sides. The ones who support him reveal themselves. The ones who don't get to prove their loyalty. Kyle considered that. And when half the council supports him? Then you know who your enemies are, and you remove them systematically instead of butchering everyone and hoping you got the right people. That's still mass executions. That's justice. There's a difference between defending your throne from actual traitors and burning people preemptively because they might become threats. The distinction seemed to penetrate Kyle's fury. His expression shifted, calculating, weighing options. If I do this your way, he said slowly, I need someone I trust running the investigation. Someone who can't be bought or intimidated. Someone the Empire respects. Celine felt her heart kick. You want me back? I want you beside me where you belong, not hiding in merchant quarters pretending you can just walk away from this. I left to protect you. You left because you were afraid. Of me. Of what we could become. Of the fact that for the first time in your life, someone made you want something beyond survival. Kael moved around the table toward her. I understand that fear. I live it every day, but running doesn't make it go away. It just makes you alone. Celine's hands trembled. If I stay, they'll use me against you. They're already using you against me. At least if you're here, we face it together. Together means vulnerable. Together means strong enough to survive what's coming. Kael stopped directly in front of her. I tried doing this alone for 10 years. It nearly destroyed me. Then you appeared and made me remember what it felt like to have someone standing beside me instead of behind me. I'm not going back to isolation, not when there's another option. Celine felt every defense she'd built crumbling. This is insane. Probably, but so is loving someone in a world that treats love like weakness. The word hung between them. Love. Unspoken until now. Admitted out loud where it could be used as ammunition. You can't love me, Celine whispered. Emperors don't love. They use. They control. Kyle kissed her, hard, desperate, like he was trying to prove something neither of them wanted to admit. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. I can't do this without you. The Empire. The reforms. Any of it. You're the only person who's ever understood what it costs to hold power and still try to use it right. Celine's resolve shattered completely. If we do this, everything changes. Everything already changed. We're just admitting it. She kissed him back. Months of restraint and distance collapsing into certainty. This was dangerous, reckless. Every strategic instinct screaming that attachment and power meant vulnerability. But vulnerability also meant having something worth protecting. And Celine was done pretending survival without purpose was the same as living. 3 days, she said when they finally broke apart. We have 3 days before Varen moves. Then we move first. Kael's expression hardened into something that belonged on a battlefield. Arrest warrants for conspiracy. Evidence gathering. Forcing them to act before they're ready. They'll claim persecution. Let them. I'm done caring what traitors think about justice. They worked through the night. Building cases, identifying coalition members, mapping connections between houses. By dawn, they had a list of 32 names. Nobles who'd coordinated with Varen, who'd signed agreements pledging support for transition. Kyle read through the names with an expression that could freeze oceans. Half of these are people my father trusted, who I kept in power because I thought loyalty was inheritable. Loyalty to your father isn't the same as loyalty to you. Clearly, he set down the list. When we arrest them, the Empire fractures. Some houses will support us. Others will see it as tyranny. We could be looking at civil war. We're already looking at civil war. They planned a coup. Either you fight now while you have advantage, or you wait until they're ready and fight from weakness. The brutal logic settled between them. There were no good options, just degrees of terrible consequences. Kael stood and moved to the window, watched dawn paint the capital in shades of fire. My father would have done this in one night, rounded them all up, public executions before sunrise, made the empire too terrified to even think about rebellion, and created the instability that led to the rebellions you had to crush. So I'm supposed to be better, more measured, give them trials and evidence and chances to defend themselves. Kael's voice went bitter. While they plot to murder me and dismantle everything I've built. Celine joined him at the window. Being better doesn't mean being weak. It means being strategic enough to win without becoming the monster they claim you are. What if the monster is what wins? Then you lose anyway, because you'll have saved an empire by becoming exactly what it doesn't need. The philosophy that had guided Kael for 10 years. The belief that his father's methods led to his father's failures, that strength without mercy created fear without loyalty. But holding on to that belief while nobles plotted his death required more courage than Celine had ever seen anyone demonstrate. Kael turned to face her. If we do this right, some of them walk free. Insufficient evidence, lack of concrete proof. They'll go back to their estates and plan better next time. Yes, that doesn't bother you? It terrifies me. But the alternative is slaughtering potentially innocent people because they might be threats. That's how tyrannies justify genocide. Kael's jaw tightened. You're asking me to be patient when every instinct I have is screaming to eliminate threats completely. I'm asking you to be the emperor the empire needs instead of the one your enemies expect. For a long moment, Kael just stared at her. Then something in his expression softened. Not weakness, acceptance. I don't know if I'm strong enough to do this your way. You are. You've been doing it for 10 years. You just forgot while I was gone. I didn't forget. I stopped believing it mattered. Celine took his hand. It matters. And I'm not going anywhere this time. We fight together or we don't fight at all. Kael's fingers tightened around hers. Together means they'll target you. They already are. At least this way I can fight back. You understand what you're agreeing to. Permanent alliance with the throne. Permanent target on your back. No retreat, no escape if this falls apart. I stopped believing in escape the day I walked into that council chamber and dismantled Malrek. This has always been about fighting. I just forgot that for a while. Kael pulled her close. Not gently, like he was trying to anchor them both to something real. If you stay, I'm going to protect you. Obsessively. Probably excessively, in ways that compromise strategic thinking. Then I'll protect you back. And we'll both be obsessive and excessive and strategic when it counts. He laughed, a rough sound that held more relief than humor. This is insane. Agreed, but we're doing it anyway. They stood together as sunrise flooded the war chamber in gold light. Two people who'd survived different hells and found something in each other that looked almost like salvation. But salvation required surviving the next 72 hours, and outside the palace walls, 32 noble houses were preparing for war. The arrest began at noon, Imperial guards moving through the capital with warrants sealed in the Emperor's personal seal. Lord Varen was taken first, dragged from his estate in full view of his household. The message clear. Planning treason had consequences. By evening, 23 nobles sat in the palace detention wing. Some raged, others demanded lawyers. A few stayed silent, calculating next moves. The empire held its breath, waiting to see if this was justice or purge, liberation or tyranny, everything depending on how the trials unfolded. Kael stood in the throne room, surrounded by advisors and generals, all shouting different strategies. Execute them immediately, hold public trials, negotiate surrender, every voice demanding something different. Enough! Kael's voice cut through the chaos. The trials begin tomorrow. Full council present, evidence presented publicly. Every defendant gets the chance to answer charges. One of the generals objected. Your Majesty, that gives them time to coordinate stories, to fabricate defenses. It also gives us time to build cases they can't refute. We're not butchering people in the dark. We're showing the empire that justice still functions. Another advisor spoke up. And if the council sides with them, if the trial becomes a platform for their narrative, then we'll know exactly who stands where, and we adjust accordingly. Celine watched from the side of the throne room, seeing Kale balance between fury and restraint, between the emperor who wanted to eliminate threats and the man who refused to become his father. It was a tightrope walk over an abyss, and one wrong step meant everything collapsed. That night, Celine stood in her restored chambers going through evidence for tomorrow's trials. Documents proving coordination, letters outlining transition plans, financial records showing preparation for regime change. It was devastating, comprehensive, exactly the kind of proof that could dismantle the entire conspiracy. But it also revealed something worse. The coalition was larger than they'd thought. Not 32 houses, closer to 40. Almost half the empire's nobility involved in some capacity. Celine's hands shook as she read through the final documents. This wasn't a small group of conspirators. This was a fundamental fracture in imperial authority. Someone knocked. Kale entered before she could answer, saw the papers spread across her desk, understood immediately. "How bad?" he asked. "Worse than we thought. 40 houses? Maybe more. Some peripheral, some central, but all connected." Kale's expression went blank. 40 houses represents half my power base. Yes. If I move against all of them, I trigger civil war. The empire splits, provinces choose sides, everything collapses. Yes. The single word hung heavy, because they both knew what it meant. Kale couldn't win this through justice. The conspiracy was too large, too entrenched. Traditional prosecution would destroy the empire before saving it, which left only one option. The option Kale had been avoiding for 10 years. The option his father would have chosen instantly. Overwhelming force. Brutal. Total. Mercy sacrificed for survival. Celine watched the calculation happen behind Kale's eyes. Saw the moment he made the decision that would define his entire reign. "I have to kill them all," he said quietly. "Every conspirator, every supporter, everyone who signed those documents, 40 noble houses erased in one night." "I know. That makes me exactly what they claimed. A tyrant, a monster, my father's son. It makes you the emperor who chose the empire over his principles." Kale's hands curled into fists. "I spent 10 years trying to be different, better, proving that strength didn't require cruelty, and now I'm about to order the largest purge in imperial history." Celine stood and crossed to him. "You tried every other option, reforms, oversight, justice. They responded with conspiracy to commit treason. At some point, mercy becomes suicide. At what point does necessary evil just become evil?" The question had no good answer. Celine knew it. Kyle knew it. They were standing at the edge of a decision that would stain the empire in blood and determine whether Kyle's reign became legend or cautionary tale. "I can't make this choice for you," Celine said softly. "But I can stand beside you whatever you decide." Kyle looked at her. Really looked. Seeing the woman who'd survived dungeons and brought down dynasties and somehow still believed he could be better than the darkness trying to consume him. "If I do this," he said, "there's no going back. The empire will remember me as the emperor who butchered 40 noble families in one night. Or they'll remember you as the emperor who saved the empire when it was about to tear itself apart. Both can be true. Yes, that's the price of power. You don't get clean hands. You just get to choose what blood stains them." Kale pulled her close, rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, and I hate that loving you is one of the only things keeping me human right now. Then keep loving me and stay human, even when you have to do inhuman things." They stood together in the quiet chamber, knowing that tomorrow would change everything, that the trials would become executions, that 40 houses would burn, that the empire would be saved or destroyed depending on how the smoke cleared. And somewhere in the palace detention wing, Lord Varen sat in his cell, smiling, because he'd already won the moment Kyle chose violence over justice, because monsters who claim they have no choice are still monsters, and the empire was about to get the tyrant it always feared Kyle could become. The only question was whether that tyrant could still remember why he'd been fighting so hard not to be one. Dawn arrived cold and merciless over Nocteres, the kind of morning that felt like the world holding its breath before violence erupted. Celine stood at the war chamber window, watching the city wake, knowing that by nightfall, 40 noble families would be erased from existence, or the empire would tear itself apart trying to stop it. Kael hadn't slept. He sat at the map table, surrounded by execution orders, waiting for his signature. Each document represented entire bloodlines, history spanning centuries, power accumulated over generations, all about to be reduced to ash because conspiracy left no middle ground. Celine approached quietly, set a hand on his shoulder, felt the tension coiled in his muscles like a spring wound too tight. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. Kael's voice came out rough. "We both know I do. There's always another option. Name it." Celine was schwenkend, because she'd spent the entire night searching for alternatives and found nothing that didn't end in civil war or successful coup. Sometimes the only choices available were variations of terrible. Kael picked up the first execution order, Lord Varen's name written in formal script at the top. "When I sign these, I become my father, the emperor who ruled through terror and called it strength. When you sign these, you become the emperor who chose survival over philosophy. There's a difference." "Is there?" Kael's eyes lifted to hers. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like 10 years of trying to be better just taught my enemies I was weak enough to exploit." "You weren't weak. You were strategic. This is you being strategic about different variables. Strategic slaughter. That's what we're calling mass executions now." The bitterness in his voice cut deep. Celine understood what was happening. Kael was mourning the version of himself that had believed mercy and strength could coexist. The emperor who'd spent a decade proving his father wrong. That version was dying in real time, sacrificed to necessity. And there was nothing Celine could say to make that death hurt less. "I'm going to sign them," Kael said finally. "All 40 orders. Then I'm going to watch the executions personally, because if I'm ordering deaths, I don't get to hide from the consequences. That will destroy you." "I'm already destroyed. This just makes it official." Before Celine could respond, the chamber doors burst open. Magistrate Soren entered at a near run, face pale with urgency. "Your Majesty, we have a situation." Kael stood. "What kind?" 8 of the detained lords have requested emergency audience. They're claiming they want to negotiate surrender terms. Kael's expression went blank. "Surrender?" "Yes. They're offering to plead guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for exile instead of execution. Full forfeiture of titles and estates. Permanent banishment from imperial territories." Celine's mind raced. "It's a trap. They're buying time or trying to split the coalition." "Probably," Soren agreed. "But if it's genuine, it creates an alternative to mass executions. Exile 40 houses instead of killing them. The empire stays intact. The conspiracy is dismantled, and you avoid becoming the emperor who butchered half the nobility in one night." Kael looked at the execution orders on his desk, then at Soren. "Which 8 requested audience?" Soren read from a list. "Minor lords, peripheral conspirators, not the core leadership. Exactly the kind of people who'd break first when consequences became real." "They're rats leaving a sinking ship," Kael said coldly, "offering surrender now because they see the executioner sharpening his blade." "Does it matter why they're surrendering?" Celine asked. "If the outcome is the same." "It matters if this is a coordinated play. 8 minor lords surrender publicly. Make me look merciful. Then the core conspirators use the distraction to launch their actual coup." The calculation was brutal, logical, exactly the kind of thinking required to survive palace politics. But it also revealed how damaged Kael's trust had become. He couldn't even accept surrender without assuming it was manipulation. "Let me talk to them," Celine said suddenly. Both Kael and Soren turned to stare at her. "Why you?" Kael asked. "Because I'm not the emperor. I can gauge whether they're genuinely terrified or playing games. And if it's a trap, they reveal it to someone who doesn't have the authority to grant mercy. No damage done." Kael's jaw tightened. "Putting you in a room with conspirators who want me dead is insane. Everything we've done for 6 months has been insane. This is just maintaining consistency." For a moment, Kael looked like he might refuse. Then something shifted in his expression. Not agreement. Acceptance that arguing wouldn't change her mind. "You get 30 minutes, he said. "Guarded room, armed escort, and if any of them threaten you, the executions begin immediately." Celine nodded. Understood. The detention wing smelled like fear and expensive cologne turned stale. 8 lords sat in a secure conference room, stripped of jewelry and formal robes. They looked diminished, human, not the predators who'd plotted treason, but men facing consequences they'd assumed would never arrive. Celine entered alone. Let them see her without guards flanking her shoulders. Let them remember she was the woman who'd brought down Malrec, who'd survived their first attempt to remove her, who'd proven that power could be dismantled from the inside by someone willing to bleed for it. Lord Hastings spoke first, an older man with gray hair and hands that trembled slightly. Miss Vaylor, we appreciate you agreeing to this meeting. I didn't agree. The Emperor sent me to determine if your surrender is genuine or another manipulation. It's genuine. We were fools, convinced by Varen that the Emperor was weak, that transition would be bloodless. Hastings' voice cracked. We didn't understand what we were truly risking until the arrest warrants arrived. Another lord nodded, younger, more desperate. We're offering full confession, exile, anything to avoid execution. Please, we have families, children who weren't involved in this. Celine studied each face, looking for deception, finding only terror. Why should the Emperor believe you? She asked. You plotted to overthrow him, coordinated with 40 houses to dismantle everything he's built. Now you want mercy because consequences became real? Yes, Hastings said simply. We were wrong, catastrophically wrong, and we're begging for the chance to accept punishment instead of death. The honesty was almost shocking. No justifications, no attempts to minimize, just raw admission of failure and fear. Celine's voice went hard. The Emperor is preparing execution orders for all 40 conspirators. Your surrender, if genuine, might save 8 lives. But it doesn't solve the larger problem. 32 houses still loyal to Varen, still planning coup. Your exile doesn't stop them. Then let us testify, another lord said urgently. We'll provide evidence, name coordinators, expose the full network, help you dismantle the conspiracy from the inside. This was the opening, the crack in the coalition that could bring down the entire structure without mass slaughter. But it also meant trusting conspirators, believing that terror had genuinely converted them from traitors to allies. Celine made a decision that would either save the Empire or doom it. I'll take your offer to the Emperor, but understand this. If you're lying, if this is a distraction while others move, your families won't just lose you. They'll lose everything, titles, property, legacy. The Empire will erase your bloodline so completely that in 50 years no one will remember you existed. The threat landed with the weight it deserved. Several lords went pale. Hastings nodded slowly. We understand and we accept. Celine returned to the war chamber where Kael was still sitting with unsigned execution orders. She explained the meeting, the offered testimony, the potential path to dismantling the conspiracy without bloodbath. Kael listened in silence. When she finished, he stood and walked to the window, stared out at the city that had no idea how close it was to fracture. You believe them, he said finally. I believe they're terrified. Whether that terror translates to genuine cooperation or calculated survival, we won't know until we test it. And if it's calculated, if we accept their surrender and they use it to coordinate escape or communication with the others, then we execute them and move forward with the original plan. But if they're genuine, we just found a way to avoid becoming the emperor who massacred half his nobility. Kael was quiet for a long time. Celine watched him process the implications, saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. The part of him that wanted to eliminate all threats warring with the part that desperately wanted to believe mercy could still function. Finally, he spoke. Conditional exile. They provide testimony. We verify everything. If it checks out, they leave the Empire alive. If any piece proves false, all 8 die publicly. That's fair? Fair! Kael laughed bitterly. Nothing about this is fair, but it might be survivable. Over the next 48 hours, the 8 lords testified, provided documentation, named coordinators, exposed communication networks, revealed that Varen's coalition wasn't as unified as they'd claimed. Several peripheral houses had joined out of fear rather than conviction. Others were waiting to see if the coup succeeded before committing fully. The testimony created fractures. Nobles who'd been planning to support the transition suddenly distancing themselves, claiming they'd been coerced or misled. The coalition that had seemed overwhelming began crumbling as self-preservation overcame loyalty to conspiracy. Kale moved methodically, arrested core conspirators, seized assets, dismantled communication networks. Not the brutal purge he'd been preparing, something more surgical. Removing cancer without killing the patient. By the end of the week, 23 conspirators sat in detention awaiting trial. 12 had fled the capital entirely, forfeiting everything. 5 had died resisting arrest, forcing the violence Kyle had been trying to avoid, but in isolated incidents rather than coordinated slaughter. And Lord Varen sat alone in his cell, watching his carefully constructed coalition collapse because 8 terrified lords had chosen survival over loyalty. The trial convened in the Grand Council chamber under circumstances that felt more like theater than justice. Every seat filled, imperial guards lining the walls, the entire empire watching to see whether their emperor would become tyrant or remain the ruler who'd spent 10 years trying to prove strength and mercy could coexist. Varen stood before the council dressed in prisoner gray, no longer the elegant lord, just a man whose gamble had failed catastrophically. The High Chancellor read the charges: conspiracy to commit treason, coordinating coup attempt, soliciting violence against the throne. Each charge carried death penalty. Kyle sat on the Emperor's throne, expression carved from ice. Selene stood to his right, not hidden, not minimized, openly beside the throne as statement of alliance. The Chancellor called Varen to answer charges. The Lord stepped forward with his dignity intact despite everything. Lord Varen, how do you plead? Guilty. His voice rang clear across the chamber. I conspired to remove Emperor Kyle from power. I believed him weak, compromised, unfit to rule. I was wrong about his weakness, but not about his compromise. He turned to face Kyle directly. You changed, Your Majesty. The Emperor who crushed 3 rebellions would never have hesitated to eliminate threats. But you did hesitate. Because of her. He gestured toward Selene. She made you soft. Made you value one woman over imperial stability. That's not weakness in the traditional sense. It's vulnerability. And vulnerability in power invites challenges. The chamber went silent. Every eye turned to Kyle. Understanding power means recognizing that sometimes your enemies tell more truth than your allies. Varen was right. Kyle had changed, had become someone who weighed mercy against strategy, who cared about individual lives instead of just empire-level outcomes. And that change had invited this coup attempt. The question was whether that change represented evolution or degradation. Kyle stood, descended from the throne, walked across the chamber until he stood face to face with Varen. You're correct, Kyle said quietly. I did change. I spent 10 years proving I could be different from my father. That strength didn't require cruelty. That power could serve purpose beyond self-preservation. He paused. Let the words sink in. And you interpreted that as weakness, as opportunity. So you gathered allies and planned to remove me. Kyle's voice went cold. But here's what you miscalculated. I wasn't weak. I was choosing restraint. There's a difference. Restraint is strategic. Weakness is inability. And when restraint fails, what remains is the very thing you should have feared from the beginning. The conqueror, Varen said, the Alpha King who crushed rebellions. No. The Emperor who understands that some threats only respond to elimination. Kale stepped back. You're right that she changed me. Made me value things beyond empire. Made me want to be better than the crown demanded. But you made the fatal mistake of assuming that meant I couldn't still be exactly as brutal as my father when the empire required it. He turned to the High Chancellor. Sentence: death by execution. To be carried out at dawn. Next case. No drama, no speeches, just absolute authority expressed through brutal efficiency. Varen's composure finally cracked. You prove my point. The moment you're threatened, you revert to tyranny. I revert to survival. You forced my hand. Now you pay the price. Guards removed Varen from the chamber. The remaining conspirators were processed rapidly. Some received execution, others exile. A few were released with forfeited titles but retained lives. Kyle made each decision with mechanical precision. No hesitation, no second-guessing. The emperor who'd agonized over every choice replaced by someone who understood that survival sometimes required becoming the thing you'd fought against. And Celine watched it happen, knowing she was witnessing the cost of power expressed through human transformation. The trials lasted 3 days. By the end, 12 conspirators had been executed, 15 exiled, 8 released with permanent loss of noble status. The empire was bloodied but intact, the coup dismantled, order restored through combination of mercy and violence that left everyone uncertain whether to celebrate justice or mourn lost innocence. On the 4th day after trials ended, Kael stood in his private chambers staring at nothing. Celine found him there as evening settled over the capital. "It's over," she said quietly. "Nothing's ever over. We just bought time until the next threat emerges." "That's the job. Buy time. Solve problems. Buy more time." Kael turned to face her. The exhaustion carved into his features looked permanent. "I executed 12 people in 3 days, destroyed families, erased bloodlines, became exactly what I spent 10 years trying not to be. You did what the Empire required." That's what my father said, every time he ordered deaths, every time he chose brutality over alternatives, that it was required, necessary, the price of stability. His voice went raw. At what point does necessary just become normal? When does the emperor who kills out of necessity become the emperor who kills because it's easier than finding other solutions? The question held no good answer, just the fundamental tension of power, how to wield it without being corrupted by it, how to do terrible things and remain the person who would only do them when alternatives failed. Celine crossed the distance between them. "You're asking the question, that's what matters. Tyrants don't question whether they've become monsters. They just assume everyone who suffers deserved it." "I don't know if that's enough." "It has to be. Because the alternative is abandoning all moral calculation and becoming pure survival instinct." Kael pulled her close, pressed his forehead against hers. "I don't know how to do this. Be the emperor the empire needs while staying the man you fell in love with. You do both. Some days better than others. And you accept that perfection is impossible when the empire itself is imperfect. That's not satisfying." "No, but it's honest." They stood together in the quiet chamber, 2 people who'd walked through fire and emerged scarred but alive, not unchanged, never unchanged, but still capable of recognizing each other beneath the damage. "I need you to promise me something," Kael said quietly. "What?" "If I start becoming my father. If the executions become easier, if I stop questioning whether I'm doing the right thing, you'll tell me, even if it costs us everything." Celine understood what he was asking. Permission to be checked, to have someone who loved him enough to see when power started consuming the man underneath. "I promise, and you do the same for me, because this goes both ways. Power corrupts everyone it touches, including the people standing beside thrones." Deal. The word carried weight of genuine covenant. Not romance. Partnership built on mutual recognition that they were both one bad decision away from becoming the predators they'd been fighting against. And that recognition was the only thing keeping them human. 6 months later, winter settled over Nocturus with snow that turned the capital into something almost peaceful. The reforms Celine had begun were fully implemented under new oversight structures that balanced efficiency against corruption prevention. Trade routes flowed, provincial courts operated under standardized regulations. The empire functioned with machinery Celine and Kael had built together. The conspiracy had left scars, empty seats in council chambers, estates seized by the crown, families displaced by exile or execution. But the empire survived, adapted, proved that radical change didn't automatically trigger collapse. Celine worked from her restored office in the administrative wing. Chief Economic Advisor. The title official this time. Authority backed by imperial decree that even hostile nobles couldn't challenge without triggering immediate audit. She was reviewing shipping projections when Magistrate Soren entered carrying sealed documents. From the southern provinces, Soren said, the first independent economic report since reforms completed. Celine opened the folder, read through pages of data, statistics on trade volume, merchant income, provincial tax revenue, infrastructure development. The numbers told a story. Commerce increasing, corruption declining. Standard of living rising in territories that had been strangled by noble exploitation. The reforms were working. Celine felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not satisfaction exactly, more like cautious acknowledgement that survival could become something more than just not dying. The council wants to discuss expansion, Soren continued, applying the same oversight structures to Western territories. Lord Hastings suggested you present the proposal. Lord Hastings, one of the 8 who'd surrendered, who'd testified against conspirators, who'd been exiled but later pardoned after evidence proved his cooperation had been genuine, now serving as advisor on noble relations. Redemption wasn't simple, but sometimes it was possible. Tell them I'll present next week, Celine said. After Soren left, Celine stood at her window watching the city move through its evening routines. Markets closing, workers heading home, life continuing with rhythm that suggested normalcy even when nothing was truly normal. The door opened behind her. She didn't turn. Knew the footsteps. Kale entered quietly. No crown. No armor. Just the exhaustion and honesty he only showed her. The Western lords are concerned about oversight expansion, he said. They're always concerned. That's how nobles stay wealthy, resisting anything that threatens their control. Should I be worried? Only if they start coordinating in secret. Right now it's just standard resistance to change. Kael moved to stand beside her. They watched the city together in comfortable silence. I've been thinking about something Varen said, Kael admitted. That you made me vulnerable, changed how I rule, made me value individual outcomes over empire-level strategy. Do you regret it? No, but I understand his concern. An emperor who cares about specific people makes different decisions than one who only calculates aggregate results. Is that bad? I don't know. My father would say yes. That caring about individuals means failing the empire, but my father also created the instability I spent 10 years fixing. Kael paused. I think caring makes me a different kind of emperor, not weaker, just calibrated differently. Celine understood what he was trying to articulate, that love hadn't made him soft, it had made him human. And humans sometimes made better decisions than calculating machines because they understood that numbers represented actual lives. You're overthinking this, she said gently. Probably, but overthinking kept me alive through 3 rebellions and a coup attempt. I'm not stopping now. Celine laughed, a real sound, the kind that came from genuine amusement rather than social performance. Then keep overthinking, and I'll keep telling you when you're being ridiculous. That's the job? That's the partnership. Kyle took her hand. You know what the nobles call you now? The silver mind of the empire. The woman who thinks 3 moves ahead of everyone else. Better than what they called me 6 months ago. Which was? The southern upstart, the emperor's weakness, the woman who'd be dead within a year. They were wrong. They were terrified. Fear makes people bad at predictions. Kyle pulled her closer. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Always. Are you happy? Actually happy? Or are you just surviving in more comfortable circumstances? The question cut deeper than expected. Celine considered it carefully. Happiness felt like the wrong word. Too simple for the complexity of what she felt. She wasn't happy the way people in provincial villages were happy, satisfied with simple pleasures and uncomplicated lives. But she wasn't just surviving either. I'm fulfilled, she said finally. I'm doing work that matters, with someone who respects what I bring. I'm making the empire better instead of just watching it crush people. That's not happiness, it's purpose. And purpose matters more. Kael's expression shifted into something that looked almost like peace. Good. Because I need you here. Not for the empire. For me. You're the only person who keeps me tethered to something real. That's a lot of pressure. You can handle it. You've handled worse. He was right. She had handled worse. Dungeons, trials, political assassination attempts, coup conspiracies, standing beside power while it consumed everything around them. And she'd survived all of it by refusing to bend. I should get back to work, Celine said. The shipping projections won't analyze themselves. They can wait. The Empire will survive another hour without us micromanaging it. Will it? Probably not, but we'll fix whatever breaks tomorrow. They stood together watching night settle over Nocteris. the city glowing beneath crystal fires and lantern light, an empire held together by constant effort and the belief that broken systems could be rebuilt if enough people cared to try. It wasn't the ending Celine had imagined during those months in the dungeon, when survival meant enduring until either rescue or death arrived. She'd never dreamed of standing beside an emperor, of reshaping imperial power, of finding someone who understood that love and power wasn't weakness. It was choosing to remain human despite everything trying to make you into something else. True strength isn't dominating everything around you. It's surviving what power does to your soul and choosing to stay connected to the things that make existence meaningful. Kale had taught her that without meaning to. Had shown her that the alpha who'd crushed rebellions could still care about individual lives. That brutality, when necessary, didn't require brutality as default. That an emperor could wield absolute authority and still question whether he was using it correctly. And Celine had taught him something in return. That being hard enough to survive wasn't the same as being so hard nothing could touch you. That vulnerability in calculated doses created strength instead of destroying it. That loving someone dangerous just meant choosing whose fire you'd stand in. "I have a question," Kael said quietly. "Go ahead. If you could go back to before the dungeon, before Malrek, before any of this, would you change it?" Celine thought about the trade architect she'd been. Competent, respected in provincial circles, living a life that would never have touched imperial power or palace politics or the brutal machinery of empire. That version of her had been safe, comfortable, completely unprepared for the violence that lurked beneath civilization's surface. "No," she said finally, "because that version of me didn't understand what she was capable of, didn't know she could survive being broken and become sharper because of it. This version is harder, more damaged, but also more real." "You don't regret it?" "I regret the pain, the months in darkness, the constant threat of death or erasure. But I don't regret who I became because of it." Kale's arms tightened around her. "I walked into that dungeon expecting to find someone broken, someone I'd use as a weapon and discard when convenient. And instead, I found someone stronger than me, who survived things I'm not sure I could have endured, who taught me that the emperor I was trying to be might actually be possible instead of just philosophy. You were always possible. You just needed someone crazy enough to believe it, or someone who refused to let me give up on myself." They stood together as the city continued breathing beneath them. An empire built on violence and trade and the constant negotiation between power and mercy. It would never be perfect. Empires were human creations, and humans were fundamentally imperfect creatures trying to build something better than themselves. But it could be functional, could protect instead of just predating, could create space for lives to be lived instead of just survived. And sometimes that was enough. Months turned into years. The reforms Celine implemented became standard imperial policy. Trade flourished. Corruption declined, though never disappeared completely. Provincial courts operated under oversight that balanced authority against abuse. The empire functioned with machinery that proved radical change didn't automatically trigger collapse. Kael ruled with precision, still brutal when necessary, still capable of violence that made enemies reconsider challenges, but tempered by constant questioning about whether brutality was required or just convenient. The emperor who'd executed 12 conspirators never forgot the weight of those deaths, carried them forward into every future decision, and Celine stood beside him. Not behind, not subservient. Equal in ways the empire struggled to understand but gradually accepted because the alternative was questioning whether their emperor could be influenced. And nobody wanted to test that particular boundary after watching what happened to conspirators. They were not perfect, had screaming arguments about policy, made mistakes that cost lives, struggled with the constant pressure of being responsible for millions of people who neither knew nor cared how hard leadership actually was. But they were partners, in power, in purpose, in the shared understanding that surviving together meant forgiving each other's failures while holding each other accountable for intentional harm. 5 years after Celine walked out of that dungeon, she stood in the same corridor where Kael had first offered her a choice between disappearing and staying visible. The palace had changed, new advisors, different guards. Magistrate Soren had retired to a country estate. Lord Hastings served as chancellor. 8 noble families that had been exiled were gradually being integrated back into imperial society under strict oversight. Everything was different, but the fundamental structure remained. Empire built on constant negotiation between power and mercy, between strength and vulnerability, between surviving and living. Selene heard footsteps. Kyle appeared around the corner, gray threading through his dark hair now, scars from old battles and new ones, still moving with the dangerous grace of someone who'd spent his life ready for threats. He stopped when he saw her. "What are you doing down here?" "Remembering. 5 years ago today, you walked into my cell and told me I was coming with you." "Best decision I ever made." "Worst decision I ever made." Kale laughed. Probably true. They walked together through corridors that had witnessed conspiracy and reform and countless moments where the empire teetered on collapse and somehow survived. Past rooms where they'd fought, planned, built something that looked almost like the vision Kyle had been chasing for 15 years. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd left me in that cell?" Selene asked. "Every day. The empire would probably be exactly the same, functional, stable, built on foundations I'd spent 10 years constructing. But I'd be alone. Still. Always. The emperor who ruled perfectly and died having never connected with anything beyond power. That doesn't sound so bad. It sounds like the loneliest existence imaginable." They reached the Eastern Palace Tower where Selene's original chambers had been located. The room was now used for visiting dignitaries, but standing in the corridor brought back memories of those first months, when everything had been new and terrifying and impossible. "I'm glad you didn't leave me," Kyle said quietly. "I did leave. Remember? Walked out and spent a month pretending I could just be anonymous. And you came back when I needed you, when the empire needed you, when choosing safety would have been completely justified." Selene thought about that month away, the boarding house, the merchant quarter, the certainty that distance would create protection. She'd been wrong. But the wrongness had taught her something crucial, that running from power didn't create safety. It just meant facing threats without resources. Better to stand in the fire with someone who understood how to survive it than to freeze alone pretending flames didn't exist. "I came back because I'm as broken as you are," Selene said, "and broken people recognize each other. We're not broken. We're adapted." "Is there a difference?" "Broken things don't function. We function. We're just scarred by the process of becoming functional." It was the most optimistic thing Kyle had ever said. And coming from someone who'd executed conspirators and crushed rebellions and carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders for 15 years, optimism felt almost revolutionary. They returned to the war chamber as evening settled over the capital. Maps spread across the table, reports from provincial governors, trade projections, military assessments, the endless machinery of empire requiring constant attention. But for once, neither of them reached for the documents immediately. They stood at the window watching the city breathe beneath them, seeing the lights flicker on as darkness arrived, hearing the distant sounds of life continuing with rhythm that suggested normalcy. "We did this," Kale said quietly. "Built something that works. Not perfectly, but better than what existed before." "We survived this," Selene corrected, "and kept surviving until survival turned into something resembling purpose. That's more philosophical than I expected." "I've had a good teacher." Kale turned to face her fully. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without arguing." Selene's chest tightened. "That's never good. I'm not my father. I spent 15 years proving it, building an empire based on function instead of fear, creating systems that protected instead of just punishing. And I did it because you showed me it was possible." "Kyle, see. Wait. Let me finish. I'm not my father, but I'm also not the man I was before you. I'm something else, something forged by trying to hold power without being destroyed by it, and that something only exists because you refused to let me give up on being human." Selene felt tears threatening. She blinked them back. "We did it together." "No, you did it. I was just stubborn enough to listen." He kissed her, not desperately like that first time in the library, gently, like someone who'd finally learned that strength didn't require constant pressure. that love expressed through quiet certainty could be more powerful than dramatic gestures. When they broke apart, Kael's forehead rested against hers. Thank you for not giving up on me when giving up would have been completely justified. Thank you for walking into that dungeon when leaving me there would have been much easier. They stood together as night deepened outside. Two people who'd survived impossible circumstances and emerged damaged but functional. Who'd learned that the price of power was constant vigilance against becoming the monster power tried to create. Who'd discovered that standing beside someone through hell was both the hardest and most important thing humans could do. The Empire would continue, would face new threats, new challenges, new moments where the choice between mercy and survival felt impossible. But they would face it together, not as emperor and advisor, not as ruler and subject, but as equals who'd walked through fire and decided that burning together was preferable to freezing alone. And somewhere in the city below, in merchant quarters and provincial estates and dungeons that still held people waiting for rescue, the Empire breathed. Imperfect, functional, held together by constant effort and the belief that broken systems could be rebuilt if enough people cared to try. The woman who'd refused to kneel in a dungeon cell had become the force that reshaped imperial power. The emperor who'd crushed rebellions had learned that strength sometimes meant choosing not to. And together, they'd built something that looked almost like hope. It wasn't the ending anyone had expected, but it was the ending they'd earned. And in a world built on power and violence and the constant negotiation between surviving and living, earned endings were the only ones that mattered.